The Buccaneers by Edith Wharton. Read by Cheri Lunghi. It was the height of the racing season in Saratoga. The thermometer stood at over 90, and a haze of sun-powdered dust hung in the elms along the street facing the Grand Union Hotel. Mrs. St. George, whose husband was one of the gentlemen most interested in the racing, sat on the wide hotel veranda, a jug of iced lemonade at her elbow and a palmetto fan in one small hand, and looked out between the immensely tall white columns of the portico, which so often reminded cultured travellers of the Parthenon at Athens, Greece. Mrs. St. George sighed to think how times had changed. Life had never been easy, but it had certainly been easier when Colonel St. George devoted less time to poker and to Wall Street. When the children were little, crinolines were still worn, and Newport had not yet eclipsed all rival watering places. Everything had changed since crinolines had gone out and bustles come in. Who, for instance, was that new woman, a Mrs. Clausen, or some such name, who had such a dusky skin for her auburn hair, such a fat body for her small, uncertain feet, and who, when she wasn't strumming on the hotel piano, was credibly reported by the domestics to lie for hours on her bedroom sofa smoking? Yes, smoking. Big Havana cigars. The gentleman, Mrs. St. George believed, treated the story as a good joke. To a woman of refinement, it could only be a subject for painful meditation. Mrs. St. George had always been rather distant in her manner to the big and exuberant Mrs. Elmsworth, who was seated at this moment nearby on the veranda. Mrs. St. George was instinctively distrustful of the advantages of ladies who had daughters of the age of her own, and Lizzie Elmsworth, the eldest of her neighbour's family, was just about the age of Virginia St. George, and might by some, those who preferred the brunette to the very blonde type, be thought as handsome. But at the thought of that new dusky Clausen woman, with the queer-looking girl who was so ugly now, but might suddenly turn into a beauty, Mrs. St. George had seen such cases, the instinct of organised defence awoke in her vague bosom, and she felt herself drawn to Mrs. Elmsworth and to the two Elmsworth girls. Lizzie Elmsworth's looks now seemed to Mrs. St. George at once more to be admired and less to be feared, and Mabel, the second Elmsworth girl, who was a year older than her own youngest, to be too bony and lantern-jawed for future danger. She no longer compared her eldest daughter and Lizzie Elmsworth with each other. She began to compare them both with the newcomer, the daughter of the unknown Mrs. Clausen. It was small comfort to Mrs. St. George that the Clausens were utterly unknown, that though Colonel St. George played poker with Mr. Clausen and had what the family called business connections with him, they were nowhere near the stage when it becomes a pleasing duty for a man to introduce a colleague to his family. Neither did it matter that Mrs. Clausen's own past was, if anything, obscurer than her husband's, and that those who said she was a poor Brazilian widow when Clausen had picked her up on a business trip to Rio were smiled at and corrected by others, presumably better informed, who suggested that divorcee was the word, and not widow. Even the fact that the Clausen girl, so-called, was known not to be Clausen's daughter, but to bear a queer exotic name like Santos Dios, even this was not enough to calm Mrs. St. George. The girl, whatever her real name, was known as Conchita Clausen, and it was of no use for Mrs. St. George to say to herself that Conchita was plain, and therefore negligible, for she had the precise kind of plainness which, as mothers of rival daughters know, may suddenly blaze into irresistible beauty. Mrs. St. George shivered under her dotted muslin ruffled with Valenciennes, and drew a tippet edged with swandown over her shoulders. At that moment, her own daughters, Virginia and Nan, wandered by, one after the other, and the sight somehow increased Mrs. St. George's irritation. "Virginia?" she called. Virginia halted, seemed to hesitate as to whether the summons were worth heeding, and then sauntered across the veranda toward her mother. "Virginia, I don't want you should go around any more with that strange girl," Mrs. St. George began. "What girl?" Virginia drawled. "Well, how do I know? Goodness knows who they are. Your pa says that she was a widow from one of those South American countries when she married Mr. Clausen. The mother was, I mean." "Well, if he says so, I suppose she was. But some people say she was just divorced, and I don't want my daughters associating with that kind of people." Virginia removed her blue gaze from her mother's boots to the little mantle trimmed with swansdown. "I should think you'd roast with that thing on," she remarked. "Ginny, now you listen to what I say," her mother ineffectually called after her. Nan St. George had taken no part in the conversation. At first she had hardly heeded what was said. Such wrangles between mother and daughter were of daily, almost hourly occurrence. Mrs. St. George's only way of guiding her children was to be always crying out to them not to do this or that. Nan St. George, at 16, was at the culminating phase of a passionate admiration for her elder sister. Virginia was all that her junior longed to be, perfectly beautiful, completely self-possessed, calm and sure of herself. Nan, whose whole life was a series of waves of the blood, hot rushes of enthusiasm, icy chills of embarrassment and self-deprecation, looked with envy and admiration at her goddess-like elder. At the moment, however, she was actually wavering in her allegiance to Virginia. Since she had seen Conchita Clausen, Nan had fallen under her spell. From the day when she had first seen her come whistling around the corner of the veranda, her restless little head crowned by a flapping leghorn hat with a rose under the brim, and dragging after her a reluctant poodle with a large red bow, Nan had felt the girl's careless power. When Mrs. St. George issued the order that her daughters were not to associate with the strange girl, as if they didn't all know her name, Nan felt a rush of anger. Virginia sauntered on, but Nan stopped short. "Why can't I go with Conchita if she wants me to?" Mrs. St. George's faintly withered pink turned pale. "If she wants you to? Annabelle St. George, what do you mean by talking to me in that way? What on earth do you care for what a girl like that wants?" Nan ground her heels into the crack between the veranda boards. "I think she's lovely." "Well, when that new governess comes next week, I guess you'll find she feels just the way I do about these people. And you'll have to do what she tells you anyhow," Mrs. St. George helplessly concluded. A chill of dismay rushed over Nan. The new governess. She had never really believed in that remote bogey, but now she seemed to hear the snap of the handcuffs on her wrist. "A governess? Me?" Mrs. St. George moistened her lips nervously. "All stylish girls have governesses the year before they come out." "I'm not coming out next year. I'm only 16, Nan protested. "Well, they have them for 2 years before." Nan's heart grew black within her. "I'll kill her if she tries to interfere with me." "You'll drive down to the station on Monday to meet her," Mrs. St. George shrilled back, defiant. Nan turned on her heel and walked away. Miss Laura Test Valley stood on the wooden platform of the railway station at Saratoga Springs, New York, and looked about her. It was not an inspiriting scene, but she had not expected that it would be, and would not have greatly cared if it had. She had been in America for 18 months, and it was not for its architectural or civic beauties that she had risked herself so far. Miss Test Valley had small means and a derelict family to assist, and her successful career as a governess in the households of the English aristocracy had been curtailed by the need to earn more money. English governesses were at a premium in the United States, and one of Miss Test Valley's former pupils had recommended her to Mrs. Russell Parmore, a cousin of the Eglingtons and the Van der Ludens, the best, in short, that New York had to offer. The salary was not as high as Miss Test Valley had hoped for, but she decided on reflection that the Parmore household might be a useful springboard, and so it proved. After conscientiously finishing Miss Parmore, a young lady whom nature seemed scarcely to have begun, Miss Test Valley decided to seek, in a different field, ampler opportunities of action. She consulted a New York governess's agency and learned that the new coal and steel people would give almost anything for such social training as an accomplished European governess could impart. Miss Test Valley fixed a maximum wage, and in a few days was notified by the agency that Mrs. Tracy St. George was ready to engage her. Now she had in her pocket the promise of $80 a month and the possibility of a more exciting task, for she understood that the St. Georges were very new, and the prospect of comparing the manners and customs of the new and the not new might be amusing. I wonder, she thought ironically, if the Duchess would see the slightest difference. The Duchess meaning always hers, the puissant lady of Tintagel, who had beaten Miss Test Valley's salary well nigh down to the level of an upper housemaid's, who had so often paid it after an embarrassingly long delay, who had been surprised that a governess should want a fire in her room or a hot soup for her schoolroom dinner. The Duchess of Tintagel was now, all unknown to herself, making up for her arrears towards Miss Test Valley. By giving Mrs. Parmore the chance to say, when she had friends to dine, "I happen to know, for instance, that at Tintagel Castle there are only open fires, and the halls and corridors are not heated at all," Miss Testvalle had obtained from Mrs. Parmore a letter of recommendation which placed her at the head of the educational sisterhood in the United States. Miss Testvalle needed this and every other form of assistance she could obtain. It would have been difficult for either Mrs. Parmore or the Duchess of Tintagel to imagine how poor she was, or how many people had, or so she thought, a lien on her pitiful savings. It was the penalty of the family glory. Miss Testvalle's grandfather was the illustrious patriot Gennaro Testavalle of Modena, fomenter of insurrections, hero of the Risorgimento, but whose fame lingered in England chiefly because he was the cousin of the old Gabriele Rossetti, father of the decried and illustrious Dante Gabriel. By the time she reached her late 30s, Laura had found it impossible, on her English earnings, to keep the grandmother, wife of the Risorgimento hero, and to aid her own infirm mother in supporting an invalid brother and a married sister with 6 children, whose husband had disappeared in the wilds of Australia. And so she had come to America. She was used to waiting in strange railway stations, her old black-beaded dolman over her arm, her modest horsehair box at her feet. One by one the other travellers scattered. At last a new dust cloud formed down the road and floated slowly nearer, till there emerged from it a lumbering vehicle of the kind which Miss Testvalle knew to be classed as hotel hacks. As it drew up, she was struck by the fact that the driver, a small dusky fellow in a white linen jacket and a hat brim of exotic width, had an orange bow tied to his whip, and a beruffled white poodle with a bigger orange bow perched between himself and the shabby young man in overalls who shared his seat, while from within she felt herself laughingly surveyed by 2 tiers of bright young eyes. The driver pulled up with a queer guttural cry to his horses, the poodle leapt down and began to dance on his hind legs, and out of the hack poured a spring torrent of muslins, sash ends, and bright cheeks under swaying hat brims. Miss Testvalle found herself in a circle of nymphs, shaken by hysterical laughter, and as she stood there, small, brown, interrogative, there swept through her mind a shred of verse which Dante Gabriel used to be fond of reciting. "Whence came ye, merry damsels? Whence came ye? So many, and such glee." And she smiled at the idea that Endymion should greet her at the Saratoga railway station. For it was clearly in search of her that the rabble-rout had come. The dancing nymphs hailed her with joyful giggles. The poodle sprang on her with dusty paws, and then turned a somersault in her honour. And from the driver's box came the twang of a guitar, and the familiar wail of "Nita Juanita, ask thy soul if we must part." "No, certainly not," cried Miss Testvalle, tossing up her head toward the driver, who responded with doffed sombrero and hand on heart. "That is to say," she added, "if my future pupil is one of the young ladies who have joined in this very flattering welcome." The enchanted circle broke, and the nymphs, still hand in hand, stretched a straight line of loveliness before her. "Guess which?" chimed simultaneously from 5 pairs of lips, while 5 deep curtsies swept the platform. And Miss Testvalle drew back a step and scanned them thoughtfully. No dominant beauty was her first impression, unless indeed the tall, fair girl with such heaps of wheat-coloured hair and such gentian blue eyes, or the very dark one, who was too pale for her black hair, but had the small imperious nose of a Roman empress. Yes, those 2 were undoubtedly beautiful, yet they were not beauties. And with the other 3, taken one by one, fault might have been found on various counts. For the one in the striped pink and white organdy, though she looked cleverer than the others, had a sharp nose, and her laugh showed too many teeth. And the one in white, with a big orange sash the colour of the poodle's bow, no doubt she was his mistress, was sallow and red-haired. As for the 5th, who seemed so much younger, hardly more than a child, her small face was such a flurry of frowns and dimples that Miss Testvalle did not know how to define her. "Well, young ladies, my first idea is that I wish you were all to be my pupils, and the second," she paused, weighed the possibilities, and met the eyes, "the second is that this is Miss Annabelle St. George, who is, I believe, to be my special charge." She put her hand on Nan's arm. "How did you know?" burst from Nan, on the shrill note of a netted bird, and the others broke into laughter. "Why, you silly, we told you so. Anybody can tell you're nothing but a baby." Nan faced about, blazing and quivering. "Well, if I'm a baby, what I want is a nurse and not a beastly English governess." Her companions laughed again and nudged each other. Miss Testvalley laughed also. "Oh, I'm used to both jobs," she rejoined briskly. "But meanwhile, hadn't we better be getting off to the hotel? Get into the carriage, please, Annabelle," she said with sudden authority. She turned to look for her trunk, but it had already been shouldered by the nondescript young man in overalls, who hoisted it to the roof of the carriage and then, jumping down, brushed the soot and dust off his hands. As he did so, Miss Testvalley confronted him, and her hand dropped from Nan's arm. "Why, Lord Richard!" she exclaimed, and the young man in overalls gave a sheepish laugh. "I suppose at home they think I'm in Brazil," he said in an uncertain voice. "I know nothing of what they think," retorted Miss Testvalley dryly, following the girls into the carriage. As they drove off, Nan, who was crowded in between Mab Elmsworth and Conchita, burst into sudden tears. "I didn't mean to call you beastly," she whispered, stealing a hand toward the new governess. And the new governess, clasping the hand, answered with her undaunted smile, "I didn't hear you call me so, my dear." "Oh, come in. Do sit down, Miss Testvalley." Mrs. St. George had expected someone taller, more majestic. She would have thought Miss Testvalley insignificant, could the term be applied to anyone coming from Mrs. Parmore. "I don't know how my daughters can have been induced to do anything so undignified. Unfortunately, the Clausen girl," she broke off, embarrassed. "The tall young girl with the auburn hair?" said Miss Testvalley. "I understand that one of the masqueraders was her brother." "Yes, her half-brother. Mrs. Clausen is Brazilian." But again Mrs. St. George checked the note of disparagement. "Ah," said Miss Testvalley. "And I'm sure my girls and the Elmsworths would never—" "Oh, quite so, I understand. I've no doubt the idea was Lord Richard's." She uttered the name as though it were familiar to her, and Mrs. St. George caught at Lord Richard. "You knew him already? He appears to be a friend of the Clausens." "I knew him in England, yes. I was with Lady Brittlesea for 2 years, as his sister's governess." Mrs. St. George gazed awestruck down this new and resonant perspective. "Lady Brittlesea?" "The Marchioness of Brittlesea, his mother. It's a very large family. I was with 2 of the younger daughters, Lady Honoria and Lady Ulrica Marrable. I think Lord Richard is the 3rd son, but one saw him at home so very seldom." Mrs. St. George drew a deep breath. She had not bargained for this glimpse into the labyrinth of the peerage, and she felt a little dizzy. "Lord Richard," continued Miss Testvalley, "always has to have his little joke." Her tone seemed to dismiss him, and all his titled relations with him. Mrs. St. George was relieved. "But your daughter Annabelle, perhaps," Miss Testvalley continued, "you would like to give me some general idea of the stage she has reached in her different studies." Mrs. St. George looked helplessly at the governess. "Oh, of course," she began. "What I attach most importance to is that my girls should be taught to behave like ladies. I may as well tell you that I don't care very much for the girls they associate with here. Saratoga is not what it used to be. In New York, of course, it will be different." When Colonel St. George bought his house in Madison Avenue, it seemed to him fit to satisfy the ambitions of any budding millionaire. But Mrs. St. George had already found out that no one lived in Madison Avenue, that the front hall should have been painted Pompeian red with a stenciled frieze, and not with naked cupids and hummingbirds on a sky-blue ground, and that basement dining rooms were unknown to the fashionable. But it was too late to change. The Colonel, who was insensitive to details, continued to be proud of his house, even when the Elmsworths, suddenly migrating from Brooklyn, had settled themselves in Fifth Avenue. He would not admit that Madison Avenue stood at best for a decent mediocrity. Mrs. St. George had first ascribed to this unfortunate locality her failure to make a social situation for her girls. Yet after the Elmsworths had come to Fifth Avenue, she noted with satisfaction that Lizzie and Mabel were not asked out much more than Virginia. The question of ball-going was almost as discouraging. One of the young men whom the girls had met at Saratoga had suggested to Virginia that he might get her a card for the first assembly, but Mrs. St. George, when sounded, declined indignantly, for she knew that in the best society girls did not go to balls without their parents. These subscription balls were a peculiar source of bitterness to Mrs. St. George. She could not understand how her daughters could be excluded from entertainment for which one could buy a ticket. Virginia had not been asked to belong, and Mrs. St. George had vainly tried to have her own name added to the list of the assembly balls. It was small comfort to learn one day that Ginny and Nan had been invited to act as Conchita Clausen's bridesmaids. She thought it unnatural that the Clausens, who were strangers in New York and still camping at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, should be marrying their daughter before Virginia was led to the altar. And then the bridegroom. Well, everybody knew that he was only a younger son, and that in England, even in the great aristocratic families, younger sons were of small account unless they were clever enough to make their own way, an ambition which seemed never to have troubled Dick Marrable. Moreover, there were dark rumours about him, reports of warnings discreetly transmitted through the British legation in Washington, and cruder tales among the clubs. Then there was the indecent haste of it. The young people had met for the first time in August, and they were to be married in November. In good society it was usual for a betrothal to last at least a year. The young people should be given time to get to know each other, the mothers of Fifth Avenue decreed, and Mrs. Parmore told Miss Testvalley, when the latter called to pay her respects to her former employer, that she, for her part, hoped her daughter would never consent to an engagement of less than 2 years. But I suppose, dear Miss Testvalley, that among the people you're with now, there are no social traditions. Miss Testvalley murmured that there were business reasons, she understood. Mr. Clausen was leaving shortly for Brazil. Ah, so they say. But of course the rumours one hears about this young man. A son of Lord Brittlesea's, I understand? But, Miss Testvalley, you were with the Brittleseas. You must have known him. It's a very big family, and when I went there, the sons were already scattered. I usually remained at Allfriars with the younger girls. Mrs. Parmore nodded softly. Quite so. And by that time, this unfortunate young man had already begun his career of dissipation in London. He has been dissipated, I believe? Lately, said Miss Testvalley, I think he's been trying to earn his living on Mr. Clausen's plantation in Brazil. Poor young man. Do his family realize what a deplorable choice he has made? Whatever his past may have been, it's a pity he should marry in New York and leave it again, without having any idea of it beyond what can be had in the Clausen set. But your pupils have been asked to be bridesmaids, I understand. Yes, the girls got to know each other last summer, and you know how exciting it is, especially for a child of Annabelle St. George's age, to figure for the first time in a wedding procession. Yes, I suppose they haven't many chances. But shouldn't you like to come upstairs and see Alita's assembly dress? White tulle, of course. Nothing will ever replace white tulle for a debutante, will it? Miss Testvalley, after that visit, felt that she had cast in her lot once and for all with the usurpers and the adventurers. Perhaps because she herself had been born in exile, her sympathies were with the social as well as the political outcasts, with the weepers by the waters of Babylon, rather than those who barred the doors of the assembly against them. Describe Miss Parmore's white tulle to her pupils, indeed. What she meant, but how to accomplish it, was to get cards for the assembly for Mrs. St. George and Virginia. But how? Through Lord Richard Marrable? Well, that was perhaps not impossible. Since the announcement of Conchita's engagement and the return of the two families to New York, there had been a good deal of coming and going between the St. George and Clausen households, rather too much to suit Miss Testvalley. But she had early learned to adapt herself to her pupils' whims while maintaining her authority over them, and she preferred to accompany Nan to the Fifth Avenue Hotel rather than to let her go there without her. Sometimes, at Mrs. Clausen's request, the governess went in with her charge. Mrs. Clausen was almost always in her dressing-room, since leaving it necessitated encasing her soft frame in stays and a heavily whaleboned dress, and she preferred sitting at her piano or lying on the sofa with a novel and a cigarette, in an atmosphere of steam heat and heavily scented flowers, and amid a litter of wedding presents and bridal finery. Sometimes Miss Testvalley divined that Mrs. Clausen wished to consult her or to confide in her, and while her pupil joined the other girls, she would clear the finery from a chair and prepare to receive Mrs. Clausen's confidences, which were usually connected with points of social etiquette, indifferent to the lady herself, but preoccupying to Mr. Clausen. "He thinks it's funny that Dick's family haven't cabled or even written. Do they generally do so in England? I tell Mr. Clausen there hasn't been time yet. I'm so bad at answering letters myself I can't blame anybody else for not writing. But Mr. Clausen seems to think it's meant for a slight. Why should it be? If Dick's family are not satisfied with Conchita, they will be when they see her. Don't you think so?" "Yes, certainly," Miss Testvalley thought so. "Lord Richard's passionately in love with Conchita, isn't he?" Mrs. Clausen pursued with her confidential smile. "It would appear so, certainly," Miss Testvalley rejoined. "All I want is that she should be happy. And he will make her happy, won't he?" the indulgent mother concluded, as though Miss Testvalley's words had completely reassured her. At that moment the door was flung open, and the bride herself whirled into the room. Conchita put her hands on her hips and spun lightly around in front of the two ladies. "Mother, isn't it a marvel? It's my assembly dress," she explained, laughing to the governess. It was indeed a marvel. The money these American mothers spent on their daughters' clothes never ceased to astonish Miss Testvalley. But while her appreciative eyes registered every costly detail, her mind was busy with the incredible fact that Conchita Clausen had contrived to get an invitation to the assembly, while her own charges, who were so much lovelier and more lovable. As she went down the stairs to the hotel entrance, Miss Testvalley muttered to herself, If I only knew how." She was so busy with her thoughts that she was startled by the appearance at the foot of the stairs of a young man who stood there visibly waiting. "Oh, Lord Richard!" she exclaimed, almost as surprised as when she had first recognized him, disguised in grimy overalls, at the Saratoga station. Since then she had of necessity run across him now and then at the St. George's as well as at Mrs. Clausen's. But if he had not perceptibly avoided her, neither had he sought her out, and for that she was thankful. The Lord Richard chapter was a closed one, and she had no wish to reopen it. Nothing of that fugitive adventure at All Friars, the Brittlesea seat, had ever been known. Of that she was certain. An ill-conditioned youth, the boon companion of his father's grooms, and a small governess, 10 years his elder, and known to be somewhat curt and distant with everyone except her pupils and their parents. Who would ever have thought of associating the one with the other? The episode had been brief. The peril was soon over. And when, the very same year, Lord Richard was solemnly banished from his father's house, it was not because of his having once or twice stolen down the schoolroom passage at undue hours, but for reasons so far more deplorable that poor Lady Brittlesea, her reserve utterly broken down, had sobbed out on Miss Testvalley's breast, anything else I know his father would have forgiven." Miss Testvalley wondered. Lord Richard stood before her awkwardly. He was always either sullen or too hearty, and she hoped he was not going to be hearty. "Could I speak to you?" he said. "We can go in there, I suppose," Miss Testvalley said, pointing to the door of the public sitting-room. She lifted the portiere and, finding the room empty, led the way to a ponderous rosewood sofa. Lord Richard shambled after her and seated himself on the other side of the table before the sofa. "Well," said Miss Testvalley, Oh, look here, I'm no hand at explaining. Never was, but you're always a friend of mine. I've no wish to be otherwise. I never know how to say things." "What is it you wish to say?" Well, Mr. Clausen asked me yesterday if there was any reason I shouldn't marry Conchita." His eyes avoided her, but she kept hers resolutely on his face. "Do you know what made him ask?" "Well, you see, there's been no word from home. I rather fancy he expected the governor to write, or even to cable." Miss Testvalley reflected. "How long ago did you write?" Lord Richard looked embarrassed, which meant, she suspected, that his letter had not been sent as promptly as he had let the Clausens believe. "You have written, I suppose?" she inquired sternly. "Oh, yes, I've written." "And told them everything? I mean about Miss Clausen's family." "Well, of course," he repeated rather sulkily. "I haven't got much of a head for that kind of thing, but I got Teddy de Santos Dios to write it all out for me." "Then you'll certainly have an answer. No doubt it's on the way now." "It ought to be. But Mr. Clausen's always in such a devil of a hurry. Everybody's in a hurry in America. He asked me if there was any reason why my people shouldn't write. Well, is there? Lord Richard turned in his chair and glanced at her with an uncomfortable laugh. Oh, you must know what I'm driving at. No, I don't. Unless you count on me to reassure the Clausens. No, only if they should take it into their heads to question you. She felt a faint shiver of apprehension. To question her? About what? Did he imagine that anyone, at this hour and at this far end of the world, would disinter that old unhappy episode? She lifted her head sternly. Nonsense, Lord Richard, speak out. Well, the fact is, I know my mother blurted out all that stupid business to you before I left Allfriars. I mean about the cheque, he muttered half-audibly. Miss Testvalley suddenly became aware that her heart had stopped beating by the violent plunge of relief it now gave. Her whole future for a moment had hung there in the balance. And after all, it was only the cheque he was thinking of. Now she didn't care what happened. She even saw, in a flash, that she had him at a disadvantage, and her past fear nerved her to use her opportunity. I've only one stipulation to make. What I'm going to ask is a trifle, yet at that age nothing is a trifle. Lord Richard, I'll back you up through thick and thin if you'll manage to get Miss Clausen's bridesmaids invited to the Assembly Ball next week. He looked at her in bewilderment. The Assembly Ball? Yes, they've invited you, I know, and your fiancé. And my two girls, the St. Georges, and their friends, the Elmsworths, are not very well known in the fashionable set which manages the assemblies. Of course, they can't all be invited, and indeed Nan is too young for balls. But Virginia St. George and Lizzie Elmsworth ought not to be left out. Such things hurt young people cruelly. Oh, but I say, I'd do anything, of course, but how the devil can I, when I'm a stranger here? Because you're a stranger. Because you're Lord Richard Marrable. I should think you need only ask one of the patronesses. Or that clever monkey Santos Diaz will help you, as he has with your correspondence. Lord Richard reddened. In any case, Miss Testvalley continued, I don't wish to know how you do it, and of course you must not say it's my suggestion. Any mention of that would ruin everything. But you must get those invitations, Lord Richard. She held him for a second with her quick, decisive smile, just touched his hand, and walked out of the room. New York society in the 70s was a nursery of young beauties, and Mrs. Parmore and Mrs. Eglinton would have told any newcomer from the old world that he would see at an assembly ball faces to outrival all the court beauties of Europe. There were rumours, now and then, that others even surpassing the assembly standard had been seen at the opera, on off nights when the fashionable let or gave away their boxes, or at such promiscuous annual entertainments as the charity ball and so on. And of late, more particularly, people had been talking of a Miss Clausen, daughter or stepdaughter of a Mr. Clausen, who had a certain notoriety in Wall Street and on the fashionable racecourses, and had now come into newspaper prominence through the engagement of his daughter, or stepdaughter, to Lord Richard Marrable, a younger son of the Marquis of Brittlesey. The assembly ladies felt it would be surprising if any Miss Clausen could compete in loveliness with Miss Alida Parmore, Miss Julia Vanderkamp, or among the married, with the radiant Mrs. Casimir Dulac or Mrs. Fred Alston, who had been a Van der Luden. They were not afraid, as they gathered on the shining floor of Delmonico's ballroom, of any challenge to the supremacy of these beauties. Miss Clausen's arrival was, nevertheless, awaited with a certain curiosity. Mrs. Parmore had been very clever about her invitation. It was impossible to invite Lord Richard without his fiancée, since their wedding was to take place the following week, and the ladies were eager to let a scion of the British nobility see what a New York assembly had to show. But to invite the Clausen parents was obviously impossible. No one knew who they were, or where they came from. But Mrs. Parmore, whose daughter's former governess was now with a family who knew the Clausens, had learned that there was a Clausen stepson, a clever little fellow with a Spanish name, who was a great friend of Lord Richard's, and was to be his best man. And of course it was perfectly proper to invite Miss Clausen with her own brother. One or two of the more conservative patronesses had indeed wavered, and asked what further concessions this might lead to. But Mrs. Parmore's party gained the day, and rich was their reward, For at the 11th hour, Mrs. Parmore was able to announce that Lord Richard's 2 sisters had unexpectedly arrived, and were anxious, they too, could anything be more gratifying, to accompany him to the ball. Their appearance for a moment overshadowed Miss Glosson's. Yet perhaps, or so some of the young men said afterward, each of the 3 girls was set off by the charms of the others. The patronesses, whose own daughters risked a momentary eclipse, were torn between fears and admiration. But after all, these lovely English girls, one so dazzlingly fair, the other so darkly vivid, who framed Miss Glosson in their contrasting beauty, were only transient visitors. No such calculation troubled the dancing men. They had found 3 new beauties to waltz with, and how they waltzed! The rumour that London dancing was far below the New York standard was not likely to find credit with anyone who had danced with the ladies Marrable. The tall, fair one was perhaps the more harmonious in her movements, but the other was as nimble as a gypsy, and if Conchita Clausen polkaed and waltzed as well as the English girls, these surpassed her in the gliding elegance of the square dance, which they performed, it was observed, with such enjoyment, such innocent abandon, that they had little to say to their partners beyond a smiling "yes," a laughing "no," or a blushing "thank you." At supper they were as bewitching as on the floor, and as conspicuously silent. As Mrs. Eglinton, with some bitterness, afterward remarked to Mrs. Parmore, the allegation that English girls had no conversation must be true, but theirs was a speaking silence. Their eyes and smiles were eloquent. She hoped it would teach their own girls that they need not chatter like magpies. In the small hours of the same night, a knock at her door waked Miss Testvalley out of an uneasy sleep. She sat up with a start, and lighting her candle, beheld a doleful little figure in a beribboned pink wrapper. "Why, Annabelle, aren't you well?" she exclaimed, setting down her candle beside the Book of Common Prayer and 2 other books which always lay together on her night table. "Oh, don't call me Annabelle, please. I can't sleep, and I feel so lonely." "My poor Nan, come and sit on the bed." "What's the matter, child? You're half frozen." Miss Testvalley sat up and drew the quilt around her pupil. "I'm not frozen, I'm just lonely. I did want to go to that ball," Nan confessed, throwing her arms about her governess. "Well, my dear, there'll be plenty of other balls for you when the time comes." "Oh, but will there? I'm not a bit sure. Well, Ginny only got to go to this one because Lord Richard fixed it up. Those old Assembly scarecrows are such snobs. Annabelle! Oh, bother, well, you know they are. If they hadn't been, wouldn't they have invited Ginny and Lizzie long ago to all their parties?" "I don't think that question need trouble us. Now that your sister and Lizzie Elmsworth have gone to the ball and have been seen, they're sure to be invited again. And when your turn comes—" Suddenly she felt herself pushed back against her pillows by her pupil's firm young hands. "Miss Testvalley, how can you talk like that when you know how they got invited?" Miss Testvalley, rearing herself up severely, shook off Nan's clutch. "Annabelle, I've no idea how they were invited. I can't imagine what you mean, and I must ask you not to be impertinent." Nan gazed at her for a moment, and then buried her face among the pillows in a wild rush of laughter. "Annabelle!" the governess repeated, still more severely, but Nan's shoulders continued to shake with mirth. "My dear, you told me you'd waked me up because you felt lonely. If all you wanted was someone to giggle with, you'd better go back to bed and wait for your sister to come home." Nan lifted a penitent countenance to her governess. "Oh, she won't be home for hours. And I promise I won't laugh any more. Only it's so funny. Oh, but do let me stay a little longer, please. Read aloud to me, there's a darling. Read me some poetry, won't you?" She wriggled down under the bedquilt, and crossing her arms behind her, laid her head back against them, so that her brown curls overflowed on the pillow. Her face had gone wistful again, and her eyes were full of entreaty. Miss Testvalley reached out for hymns, ancient and modern. But after a moment's hesitation, she put it back beside the prayer book, and took up instead the volume of poetry which always accompanied her on her travels. Almost solemnly she began to read, lowering her voice as she saw Nan's lids gradually sink over her eyes, till at last the long lashes touched her cheeks. Miss Testvalley murmured on, ever more softly, to the end. Then, blowing out the candle, she slid down to Nan's side so softly that the sleeper did not move. She might have been my own daughter, the governess thought, composing her narrow frame to rest and listening in the darkness to Nan's peaceful breathing. Lord Richard Marrable, as it turned out, had underrated his family's interest in his projected marriage. No doubt, as Miss Testvalley had surmised, his announcement of the event had been late in reaching them, but the day before the wedding a cable came. It was not, however, addressed to Lord Richard or to his bride, but to Miss Testvalley, who, having opened it with surprise, for she had never before received a cable, read it in speechless perplexity. "Is she black? His anguished mother, Selina Brittlesey." For some time the governess pored in vain over this cryptic communication, but at last light came to her, and she leaned her head back against her chair and laughed. She understood just what must have happened. Though there were two splendid globes, terrestrial and celestial, at the opposite ends of the Allfriars library, no one in the house had ever been known to consult them, and Lady Brittlesey's geographical notions, even measured by the family standard, were notoriously hazy. Miss Testvalley remembered that on one wall of the Van Dyck saloon, where the family sometimes sat after dinner, there hung a great tapestry, brilliant in colour, rich and elaborate in design, in the foreground of which a shapely young negress, flanked by ruddy savages and attended by parakeets and monkeys, was seen offering a tribute of tropical fruits to a lolling divinity. The housekeeper, Miss Testvalley also remembered, in showing this tapestry to visitors, on the day when Allfriars was open to the public, always designated it as the Spanish Main and the Americas. And what could be more natural than that poor, bewildered Lady Brittlesey should connect her son's halting explanations with this instructive scene? Miss Testvalley pondered for a long time over her reply. Then she cabled back to Lady Brittlesey, "No, but comely." On a June afternoon of the year of 1875, one of the biggest carriages in London drew up before one of the smallest houses in Mayfair, the very smallest in that exclusive quarter its occupant, Miss Jacqueline March, always modestly averred. The lady who descended from the carriage was, like her conveyance, large and rather shabby, though undeniably impressive. A freshly starched parlour-maid let her in with a curtsy of recognition. "Miss March is in the drawing-room, milady." She led the visitor up the narrow stairs and announced from the threshold, "Please, miss, Lady Brittlesey." Two ladies sat in the drawing-room in earnest talk. One of the two was vaguely perceived by Lady Brittlesey to be small and brown, with burning black eyes, which did not seem to go with her stiff purple poplin and old-fashioned beaded dolman. The other lady was also very small, but extremely fair and elegant. She hurried hospitably forward. "Dearest Lady Brittlesey, what a delightful surprise. You're not going to leave us, Laura?" It was clear that the dark lady addressed as Laura was meant to do exactly what her hostess suggested she should not. She was out of the room with the ease and promptness of a person long practised in self-effacement. Lady Brittlesey sent a vague glance after the retreating figure. "Now, who is that, my dear? I seem to know her." Miss March replied without hesitation, "An old friend, Lady Brittlesey, Miss Testvalley, who used to be governess to the Duchess's younger girls at Tintagel. I wish she could have stayed. You might have been interested in her experiences in America." "In America?" "In the States. In fact, I think she was governess to that new beauty who's being talked about a good deal just now. A Miss St. George? Virginia St. George. You may have heard of her." Lady Brittlesey drew herself up and said testily, "But of course she was in America, and with some people called St. George. How else would I have known where to send my cable?" "You cabled, Miss Testvalley?" "When we learned of my son Richard's engagement, I asked Testvalley if the young woman was black, and I received such an odd reply. 'No, but comely.' Such a strange expression." "The Psalms," Miss March suggested gently. "The Song of Songs? My love is black but comely?" "But do tell me if you have heard of Virginia St. George, the beauty." "I hear of nothing but Americans. My son's house is always full of them." "Oh, yes, and I believe Miss St. George is a particular friend of Lady Richard's." "Very likely. Is she from the same part of the States? From Brazil?" Miss March, who was herself a native of the States, had in her youth been astonished at inquiries of this kind, and slightly resentful of them. But long residence in England and a desire to appear at home in her adopted country had accustomed her to such geography as Lady Brittlesley's. "Slightly farther north, I think," she said. "Ah, but they make nothing of distances in those countries, do they? Is this new young woman rich?" asked Lady Brittlesley abruptly. Miss March reflected and then decided to say, "According to Miss Testvalley, the St. Georges appear to live in great luxury." Lady Brittlesley sank back wearily. "That means nothing. My daughter-in-law's people live in luxury too, but Mr. Clausen, her stepfather, has never paid her settlements. And now, not even 2 years after their marriage, the man says he can't go on paying his stepdaughter's allowance. And I'm afraid the young people owe a great deal of money." Miss March heaved a deep sigh of sympathy. "Do you suppose those other people would lend them the money?" Miss March counted it as one of the many privileges of living in London that 2 or 3 times a year her friend Lady Brittlesley came to see her. In Miss March's youth a great tragedy had befallen her. She had been jilted by an eminent nobleman. Yes, and after the wedding dress was ordered. But since the unhappy date, over 30 years had slipped by, and gradually, as they passed, and as people found out how friendly and obliging she was, and what a sweet little house she lived in, she had become the centre of a circle of warm friends, and the oracle of transatlantic pilgrims in quest of a social opening. Miss March had a kind heart, and could never resist doing a friend a good turn. And if her services were sometimes rewarded by a cheque, or a new drawing-room carpet, or a chinchilla tippet and muff, she saw no harm in this way of keeping herself and her house in good shape. All this passed through Miss March's active mind while she sat listening to Lady Brittlesley. Even should friendship so incline them, she doubted if the St. George family would be able to come to the aid of the young Dick Marrables. But there might be combinations, arrangements. Who could tell? "Dear Lady Brittlesley, I'm so dreadfully distressed at what you tell me." "Yes, it's certainly very unlucky, and most trying for my husband. And I'm afraid poor Dick's not behaving as well as he might. After all, as he says, he's been deceived." "I'll make inquiries," said Miss March. Lady Brittlesley drew herself up from the sofa corner. Miss March followed her to the landing without speaking. There her visitor suddenly turned toward her. "I wish we could marry Seddon," she said. This allusion to the heir of the Brittlesleys was a fresh surprise to Miss March. "But surely in Lord Seddon's case it will be only too easy," she suggested with a playful smile. Lady Brittlesley produced no answering smile. "Well, you must have heard, I suppose, of his wretched entanglement with Lady Chert. It's much worse, you know, than if she were a disreputable woman. She costs him a great deal more, I mean. And we've tried everything, but he won't look at a nice girl." She paused, her wistful eyes bent entreatingly on Miss March's responsive face. "And so, in sheer despair, I thought perhaps if this friend of my daughter-in-law, this St. George girl, is rich, really rich, it might be better to try... Well, there's something about these foreigners that seems to attract the young men." Yes, there was, as Jackie March had reason to know. Her own charm had been subtler and more discreet, and in the end it had failed her. But the knowledge that she had possessed it gave her a feeling of affinity with this new band of marauders. Social aliens though they were, the wild gypsy who had captured Dick Marrable, and her young friends who 2 years later had come out to look over the ground and do their own capturing. Miss March, who was always on her watchtower, had already sighted and classified them. The serenely lovely Virginia St. George and her younger sister Nan, negligible as yet compared with Virginia, but odd and interesting too. It was a novel kind of invasion, and Miss March was aflutter with curiosity. So far she knew only that fashionable New York had rejected them. In the long summer twilight, a father and son were pacing the terrace of an old house called Honourslove, on the edge of the Cotswolds. The irregular silver-grey building, when approached from the village by a drive winding under ancient beech trees, seemed to lie almost in a hollow, screened to the north by hanging woods, and surveying from its many windows only its own lawns and trees. But the terrace on the other front overlooked an immensity of hill and vale, with huddled village roofs and floating spires. The Cotswolds were in the blood of the Thwarts, and their rule at Honourslove reached back so far that the present baronet, Sir Helmsley Thwart, had persuaded himself that only by accident or treachery had their title to the estate dropped out of the Doomsday. His only son, Guy, was not so sure, but tradition, as embodied in the ancient walls and the ancient trees of Honourslove, seemed to him as priceless a quality as it did to Sir Helmsley. And indeed, he sometimes said to himself that if ever he succeeded to the baronetcy, he would be a safer and more vigilant guardian than his father, who loved the place and yet had so often betrayed it. "I'd have shot myself rather than sell the Titian," Guy used to think in moments of bitterness. There were times when the young man felt that if each could have read the other's secret mind, they would have found little to unite them, except a joint love of their house and the land it stood on. But that love was so strong and went so deep that it sometimes seemed to embrace all the divergences. Would it now? Guy wondered. How the devil shall I tell him, he thought. The two had paused and stood looking out over the lower terraces to the indistinct blue reaches beyond. Lights were beginning to prick the dust, and every roof which they revealed had a name and a meaning to Guy Thwart. Red Farm, where the famous hazel copse was. Osprey, with its decaying Norman church. Little Osprey, with the old heronry. Odcote, Sudcote, Loudon. All were thick with webs of memory for the youth whose people had so long been rooted in their soil. All those frail, innumerable webs tightened around him like chains at the thought that in a few weeks he was to say goodbye to it all, probably for many months. After preparing for a diplomatic career, Guy Thwart had suddenly decided that he was not made for diplomacy, and braving his father's wrath at this unaccountable defection, had settled down to a period of hard drudgery with an eminent firm of civil engineers who specialized in railway building. Though he had a natural bent for the work, he would probably never have chosen it, had he not hoped it would be a quick way to wealth. He preferred making a fortune to marrying one, and it was clear that sooner or later a great deal of money would be needed to save Honourslove and keep it going. Guy's stage of drudgery as an engineer was now over, and he had been chosen to accompany one of the members of the firm on a big railway building expedition to South America. He leaned on the balustrade and let his mind wander over the rich darkness of the countryside. "Well, out with it," Sir Helmsley broke forth abruptly. Guy straightened himself with a laugh. "All I want is to have you ask some people to tea." "Some people?" Sir Helmsley puffed dubiously at his cigar. "I ran across them the other day in London, and as I know they're going to spend next Sunday at Allfriars, I thought—" Sir Helmsley Thwart drew the cigar from his lips and looked along it as if it were a telescope, at the end of which he saw an enemy approaching. "Americans?" he queried, in a shrill voice, unlike his usual baritone. "Well, yes." I suppose it's because you know I hate the whole tobacco-chewing crew, the dressed-up pushing women dragging their reluctant backwoodsmen after them, that you suggest polluting my house and desecrating our last few days together by this barbarian invasion, eh?" There had been a time when his father's outbursts, even when purely rhetorical, were so irritating to Guy that he could meet them only with silence. He smiled and said, "I don't seem to recognize my friends from your description." "Your friends? Your friends? How many of them are there?" "Only 2 sisters, the Miss St. Georges. The rumour is that the oldest is going to marry Seddon." "Seddon? Marry Seddon? Good God, are the Brittleses out of their minds? There won't be a family left in England without that poison in their veins." Sir Helmsley walked away a few paces and then returned to where his son was standing. "Why do you want these people asked here?" I like them," Guy stammered. "Like them? Guy, why do you want these women here? Is it because you've lost your head over one of them? I've a right to an answer, I think." Guy Thwart appeared to have none ready. Too many thoughts were crowding through his mind. When I spoke, I really hadn't got beyond, well, just wanting to see her again. "For God's sake, Guy, you're not going to bring an American wife to Honourslove. I shan't shut an eye tonight unless you tell me." "And you won't shut an eye if I tell you yes." "Damn it, man, don't fence." "I'm not fencing, sir. I'm laughing at your way of jumping at conclusions. I shan't take any wife till I get back from South America, and there's not much chance that this one would wait for me till then, even if I happened to want her to." "Ah, well, I suppose this last week, if you were to ask me to invite the devil, I should have to do it." The terrace of Honourslove had never looked more beautiful than on the following Sunday afternoon. The party from Allfriars, Lady Richard Marrable, her brother-in-law, Lord Seddon, and the 2 young ladies from America had been taken through the house by Sir Helmsley and his son, and, after strolling along the shady banks of the Love, murmuring in its little glen far below, had returned by way of the gardens to the chapel, hooded with ivy at the gates of the park. And now, turning back to the house, they were looking out from the terrace over the soft reaches of country, bathed in afternoon light. After the shabby vastness of Allfriars, everything about Honour's Love seemed to Nan St. George warm, cared for, exquisitely intimate. The stones of the houses, the bricks of the walls, the very flags of the terrace were so full of captured sunshine that in the darkest days they must keep an inner brightness. Nan found herself suddenly at ease with the soft, mellow place, as though some secret thread of destiny attached her to it. Guy Thwart, somewhat to her surprise, had kept at her side during the walk and the visit to the chapel. He had not said much, but with him also Nan felt instantly at ease. In his answers to her questions she had detected a latent passion for every tree and stone of the beautiful old place, a sentiment new to her experience, as a dweller in houses without histories, but exquisitely familiar to her imagination. "Why Honour's Love?" Nan asked as they slowly paced the terrace. "I know there's a river Love, but why—" Guy smiled. "Do you know the poem by Lovelace?" Nan shook her head, her brown eyes eager. "He was leaving his lady to go to the wars, and he ends, 'I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honour more.'" They had walked together to the far end of the terrace before Nan noticed that the others, guided by Sir Helmsley, were passing through the glass doors into the hall. Nan turned to follow, but her companion laid his hand on her arm. "Stay," he said quietly. Without answering, she perched herself on the ledge of the balustrade and looked up at the long honey-coloured front of the house, with the great craven shield above the door and the quiet lines of cornice and window frames. "I wanted you to see it in this light. It's magic hour," he explained. She turned her glance from the house to his face. "I see why Conchita says it's the most beautiful place in England." He smiled. "I don't know. I suppose if one were married to a woman one adored, one would soon get beyond her beauty. That's the way I feel about Honour's Love. It's in my bones." "Oh, then you understand," she exclaimed. "Understand?" Nan coloured a little. The words had slipped out. "I mean, about the beyondness of things. I know there's no such word. There's such a feeling. When 2 people have reached it together, it's, well, they are beyond." He broke off. "You see now why I wanted you to come to Honour's Love?" he said in an odd new voice. She was still looking at him thoughtfully. "You knew I'd understand?" "Oh, everything." She sighed for pleasure, but then, "No, there's one thing I don't understand. How you go away and leave it for so long." He gave a nervous laugh. "You don't know England. That's part of our sense of beyondness. I'd do more than that for these old stones." Nan bent her eyes to the worn flags on the terrace. "I see. That was stupid of me." For no reason at all, the quick colour rushed to her temples again, and the young man coloured too. "It's a beautiful view," she stammered, suddenly self-conscious. "It depends who looks at it," he said. She dropped to her feet and turned to gaze away over the shimmering distances. Guy Thwart said nothing more, and for a long while they stood side by side without speaking, each seeing the other in every line of the landscape. Mrs. St. George had been bitterly disappointed in her attempt to launch her daughters in New York. Scandalized though she was by Virginia's part in the wretched practical joke played on the Assembly patronesses by Lord Richard Marrable and Conchita, she could not think that such a prank would have lasting consequences. Miss Testvalley, too, was terribly upset about the ball, but she did not share Mrs. St. George's view that Virginia and Nan, by acting as bridesmaids to Conchita Clausen, had made matters worse. At the wedding their beauty had been much remarked, and as Miss Testvalley pointed out, Conchita had married into one of the greatest English families, and if ever the girls wanted to do a London season, knowing the Brittleseys would certainly be a great help. "A London season?" Mrs. St. George gasped. Miss Testvalley laughed. "Why not? It might be much easier than New York. You ought to try," that intrepid woman declared. And so Mrs. St. George and her two daughters had, they hardly knew how, drifted, or been whirled, into this wild project. And now, on a hot July afternoon, when Mrs. St. George would have been so happy sipping her lemonade in friendly company on the Grand Union veranda, she sat in the melancholy exile of a London hotel and wondered when the girls would get back from that awful performance they called the Queen's Drawing Room. There had been times, she remembered ruefully, when she had not been happy at Saratoga, had felt uncomfortable in the company of the dubious Mrs. Clausen, and irritated by the vulgar exuberance of Mrs. Elmsworth. But such was her present loneliness that she would have welcomed either with open arms. And it was precisely as this thought crossed her mind that the bellboy knocked on the door to ask if she would receive Mrs. Elmsworth. "Oh, my dear!" cried poor Mrs. St. George, falling on her visitor's breast, and 2 minutes later the ladies were mingling their loneliness, their perplexities, their mistrust of all things foreign and unfamiliar, in an ecstasy of interchanged confidences. The confidences lasted so long that Mrs. Elmsworth did not return to her hotel until after her daughters. She saw at once that they were out of humour with each other, if not with the world. Mrs. Elmsworth disliked gloomy faces, and on this occasion felt herself entitled to resent them, since it was to please her daughters that she had left her lazy, pleasant cure at Bad Elms to give them a glimpse of the London season. "Well, girls, you look as if you were just home from a funeral," she remarked. "Well, we are. We've just seen all the old corpses in London dressed up for that circus they call the drawing room," said her eldest daughter. "They weren't all corpses, though," Mab interrupted. "What do you think, Mother? We saw Ginny and Nan St. George rigged out to kill, feathers and all, in the procession." Mrs. Elmsworth manifested no surprise. "Yes, I know. I've just been sitting with Mrs. St. George. There was a Miss March came in while I was with her. Such a sweet little woman. An American, but she's lived here for years in London and knows everybody." Mrs. St. George, in her loneliness, had besought Mrs. Elmsworth to return the next afternoon. She didn't dare invite Lizzie and Mab, she explained, because her own girls were being taken to see the Tower of London by some of their new friends. But if Mrs. Elmsworth would just drop in and sit with her, Mrs. St. George thought perhaps Miss March would be coming in too, and then they would talk over plans for the rest of the summer. Lizzie Elmsworth hated the St. George girls for having got ahead of her in their attack on London, but was instantly disposed to profit by the breach they had made. Virginia St. George was not clever, and Lizzie would be able to guide her. They could be of the greatest use to each other, if the St. Georges could be made to enter into the plan. Exactly what plan Lizzie herself did not know, but she felt instinctively that, like their native country, they could stand only if they were united. "I guess I'll go with you," she announced, when her mother rose to put on her bonnet for the call. "Why, the girls won't be there. She told me so," said Mrs. Elmsworth, surprised. "I don't care about the girls. I want to see that Miss March." When the Elmsworth ladies were shown in, Miss March was already sitting with Mrs. St. George. Miss Testvalley, the day before, had told her all about Lizzie Elmsworth, whom some people thought, in her different way, as handsome as Virginia, and certainly cleverer. And here she was, stalking in ahead of her mother in what appeared to be the new American style, and carrying her slim height and small regal head with an assurance which might well eclipse Virginia's milder light. Miss March surveyed her with the practised eye of an old frequenter of the marriage market. To Mrs. Elmsworth, whom she greeted with her most persuasive smile, she said engagingly, "Mrs. St. George and I have such a delightful plan to suggest to you. Of course, you won't want to stay in London much longer. It's so hot and crowded. Mrs. St. George tells me that you're both rather wondering where to go next, and I've suggested that you should join her in hiring a lovely little cottage on the Thames belonging to a friend of mine, Lady Chert. It could be had at once, servants and all, the most perfect servants, and I've stayed so often with Lady Chert that I know just how cool and comfortable and lazy one can be there. But I was thinking more especially of your daughters and their friends. The river's a paradise at their age, the punting by moonlight, and all the rest." Long past memories of the river's magic brought a sigh to Miss March's lips, but she turned it into a smile as she raised her forget-me-not eyes to Lizzie Elmsworth's imperial orbs. Lizzie returned the look, and the two immediately understood each other. "Why, Mother, that sounds perfectly lovely. You'd love it too, Mrs. St. George, wouldn't you?" Lizzie smiled, stooping gracefully to kiss her mother's friend. She had no idea what punting was, but the fact that it was practiced by moonlight suggested the exclusion of rheumatic elders and a free field, or river rather, for the exercise of youthful arts. In those she felt confident of excelling. The lawn before Lady Chert's cottage, or bungalow as the knowing were beginning to say, spread sweetly to the Thames at Runnymede. With its long deck-like veranda, its awnings stretched from every window, it seemed to Nan St. George a fairy galleon making all sails set for the river. Swans, as fabulous to Nan as her imaginary galleon, sailed majestically on the silver flood, and boats, manned by beautiful bare-armed athletes, sped back and forth between the flat grass banks. At first, Nan was the only one of the party on whom the river was not lost. Virginia's attention travelled barely as far as the circles of calceolarias and lobelias dotting the lawn, and the vases of red geraniums and purple petunias which flanked the door. She liked the well-kept flowers and bright turf, and found it pleasant on warm afternoons to sit under an ancient cedar and play at the newfangled tea-drinking, into which they had all been initiated by Miss March, with the aid of Lady Chert's accomplished parlour-maid. Lizzie Elmsworth and Mabel also liked the tea-drinking, but were hardly aware of the great blue-green boughs under which the rite was celebrated. To Lady Richard Marrable, the Thameside cottage offered a happy escape from her little house in London. She came down often, always bringing the right people with her, and combining parties and inventing amusements, which made invitations to the cottage as sought after as cards to the royal enclosure. No one followed the Runnymede revels with a keener eye than Miss Testvalley. The invasion of England had been her own invention, and from 1,000 little signs she already knew it would end in conquest. But from the outset she had put her charges on their guard against a too easy triumph. The young men were to be allowed as much innocent enjoyment as they chose, but Miss Testvalley saw to it that they remembered the limits of their liberty. It was amusement enough to be with a group of fearless and talkative girls who said new things in a new language, who were ignorant of tradition and unimpressed by distinctions of rank, but it was soon clear that their young hostesses must be treated with the same respect, if not with the same ceremony, as English girls of good family. Miss March was an admirable lieutenant, supplying the social experience which Miss Testvalley lacked, and between them they administered the cottage at Runnymede like an outpost in a conquered province. Miss March, who was without Miss Testvalley's breadth of vision, was slightly alarmed by the audacities of the young ladies, and secretly anxious to improve their social education. "I don't think they understand yet what a duke is," she sighed to Miss Testvalley, after a Sunday when Lord Seaton had unexpectedly appeared at the cottage with his cousin, the young Duke of Tintagel. "What attracts the young men is the girls' naturalness," said Miss Testvalley, "and their not being afraid to say what they think." Miss March sighed again, and said she supposed that was the new fashion. Certainly it gave the girls a better chance. Lord Seaton's sudden appearance at the cottage seemed, in fact, to support Miss Testvalley's theory. Miss March remembered Lady Edina Chert's emphatic words when the lease had been concluded. "I'm ever so much obliged to you, Jackie. You've got me out of an awfully tight place by finding tenants for me and getting such a good rent out of them. I only hope your American beauties will want to come back next year. But I've forbidden Seaton to set foot in the place while they're there, and if Conchita Marrable coaxes him down, you must swear you'll let me know, and I'll see it doesn't happen again." Miss March had obediently sworn, but she saw now that she must conceal Lord Seaton's visits instead of denouncing them. Poor Edina's exactions were obviously absurd. If she chose to let her house, she could not prevent her tenants from receiving anyone they pleased, and it was clear that the tenants liked Seaton, and that he returned the sentiment. For after his first visit, he came often. Lady Chert, luckily, was in Scotland, and Miss March trusted to her remaining there till the lease of the cottage had expired. About this time, Miss Testvalley began to wonder if the atmosphere of Runnymede were not a little too stimulating for Nan's tender sensibilities. Since Teddy de Santos Dias, who had joined his sister in London, had taken to coming down with her for Sundays, the fun had grown fast and furious. Practical jokes were Teddy's chief accomplishment, and their preparations involved rather too much familiarity with the upper ranges of the house, too much popping in and out of bedrooms, and too many screaming midnight pillow fights. Miss Testvalley saw that Nan, whose feelings always rushed to extremes, was growing restless and excited, and she felt the need to shield the girl and keep her apart. "I do think Nan ought to get away for 2 or 3 weeks," she suggested to Mrs. St. George. "I know a quiet little place in Cornwall where she could have some bathing and go to bed every night at 9. To everyone's surprise, Nan offered no objection. The prospect of seeing new places stirred her imagination. "Shall we see some other places as beautiful as Honour's Love?" The governess reflected. She had not contemplated a round of sightseeing for her pupil, and Cornwall did not seem to have many sights to offer. But at length she said, "Well, Trevenick is not so far from Tintagel. If the family are away, I might take you there, I suppose." The Duke of Tintagel was a young man burdened with scruples. He meant, if possible, to keep up in suitable state both the new castle at Tintagel and Longlands, the seat in Somersetshire, as well as Folliot House, his London residence, but he meant to do so without the continued drain on his fortune which his father had been obliged to incur. The new Duke hoped that by devoting all his time and most of his faculties to the care of his estate and the personal supervision of his budget, he could reduce his cost of living without altering its style. And the indefatigable Duchess was not the woman to let her son forget the importance of her aid. Though a perfect understanding had always reigned between them, recent symptoms made it appear that the young Duke was beginning to chafe under her regency. Soon after his visit to Runnymede, he and his mother sat together in the Duchess's boudoir in the London house. The Duchess invariably arranged to have this hour alone with her son, when breakfast was over, and her daughters, of whom death or marriage had claimed all but 3, had gone their different ways. "I was hoping," she said, noticing that the Duke had twice glanced at the clock, "that you'd managed to get away to Scotland for a few days. The Hopeleys particularly wanted you to go to them at Loch Scarrig. Lady Hopeley wrote yesterday to ask me to remind you." The Duchess was small of stature, with firm round cheeks, a small mouth, and quick dark eyes under an anxiously wrinkled forehead. She did not often smile, and when, as now, she attempted it, the result was a pucker, similar to the wrinkles on her brow. "You know that someone else will be very grieved if you don't go," she insinuated archly. The Duke's look passed from faint ennui to marked severity. He glanced at the ceiling and made no answer. "My dear Ushant," said the Duchess, who still called him by the title he had borne before his father's death, "surely you can't be blind to the fact that poor Jean Hopeley's future is in your hands. It is a serious thing to have inspired such a deep sentiment." "I will never marry anyone who hunts me down for the sake of my title," exclaimed the Duke abruptly. His mother raised her neat dark eyebrows in a reproachful stare. "For your title? But, my dear Ushant, surely Jean Hopeley—" "Jean Hopeley is like all the others. I'm sick of being tracked like a wild animal," cried the Duke, who looked excessively tame. The Duchess gave a deep sigh. "Ushant." "Well?" "You haven't, well, it's not possible, formed an imprudent attachment. You're not concealing anything from me." The Duke's smiles were almost as difficult as his mother's, but his muscles made an effort in that direction. "I shall never form an attachment until I meet a girl who doesn't know what a duke is." "Well, my dear, I can't think where one could find a being so totally ignorant of everything on which England's greatness rests," said the Duchess impressively. "Then I shan't marry." "Oh, shan't. I'm sorry, Mother." She lifted her sharp little eyes to his. "You remember the roof at Tintagel has still to be paid for?" "Yes." "Oh, dear Jean's settlements would make all that so easy. There's nothing the Hopeleys wouldn't do." The Duke interrupted her. "Why not marry me to a Jewess? Some of those people in the city could buy up the Hopeleys and not feel it." The Duchess drew herself up. Her lips trembled, but no word came. Her son stalked out of the room. From the threshold he turned to say, "I shall go down to Tintagel on Friday night to go over the books with Blair." The Duke got into the train on the Friday with a feeling of relief. His high and continuous sense of his rank was combined with a secret desire for anonymity. If he could have had himself replaced in the world of fashion and politics by a mechanical effigy of the Duke of Tintagel, while he himself went obscurely about his private business, he would have been a happier man. Undoubtedly his mother had been a great help, but the Duke's conscience could not compel him to accept a marriage arranged by his mother. That part of his life he intended to arrange for himself. and though he was ostensibly going to Tintagel on estate business, his real purpose was to think over his future in solitude. A salt mist was drifting to and fro down the coast as the Duke, the next afternoon, walked along the cliffs towards the ruins of the old Tintagel. Since early morning he had been at work with Mr. Blair, the agent, going into the laborious question of reducing the bills for the roof of the new castle, and examining the other problems presented by the administration of his great domain. After that, with agent and housekeeper, he had inspected every room in the castle, carefully examining floors and ceilings, and seeing to it that Mr. Blair recorded the repairs to be made. The troublesome question of his marriage was still foremost in his mind, for after inspecting the castle, he felt more than ever the impossibility of escaping from his ducal burdens. Yet how could the simple-hearted girl of whom he was in search be induced to share the weight of these great establishments? Though the Duke sought simplicity, he dreaded dullness. Dimly conscious that he was dull himself, he craved the stimulus of a quicker mind. Yet he feared a dull wife less than a brilliant one, for with the latter, how could he maintain his superiority? He remembered his discomfort among those loud, rattling young women whom his cousin Seddon had taken him to see at Runnymede. Very handsome they were, each in her own way, nor was the Duke insensible to beauty. One especially, the fair one, had attracted him. She was less noisy than the others, and would have been an agreeable sight at the breakfast table, and she carried her head in a way to show off the Tintagel jewels. But marry an American? The thought was inconceivable. After their early swim, the morning had turned so damp and foggy that Miss Testvalley said to Nan, "I believe this would be a good day for me to drive over to Polwelly and call at the vicarage. You can sit in the garden a little while if the sun comes out." But an hour or two after Trevennick's only fly had carried off Miss Testvalley, the corner where Nan sat became a balcony above a great sea drama. A twist of the wind had whirled away the fog, and there of a sudden lay the sea in a metallic glitter, with white clouds storming over it, hiding and then revealing the fiery blue sky between. Sit in the shelter of the fuchsia hedge on such a day? Not Nan. Her feet were already dancing on the sunbeams, and in another minute the gate had swung behind her, and she was away to meet the gale on the downs above the village. When the Duke of Tintagel reached the famous ruin from which he took his name, another freak of the wind had swept the fog in again. The sea was no more than a hoarse sound on an invisible shore, and he climbed the slopes through a cloud filled with the stormy clash of sea-birds. He had thought he had the wild place to himself, but as he advanced towards the edge of the upper platform of the castle, he perceived that his solitude was shared by a young lady who, as yet unaware of his presence, stood wedged in a coign of the ramparts, absorbed in the struggle between wind and sea. She had not the kind of beauty to whirl a man off his feet, and his eye was free to note that her complexion, though now warmed by the wind, was naturally pale, that her nose was a trifle too small, and her hair a tawny, uncertain mixture of dark and fair. Nothing overpowering in all this, but being overpowered was what the Duke most dreaded. The face he was studying was so grave, yet so happy, that he felt somehow reassured and safe. This girl, at any rate, was certainly not thinking of dukes, and in the eyes she presently turned to him, he saw not himself, but the sea. He raised his hat and she looked at him, surprised but not disturbed. "Oh, I didn't know you were there," she said simply. "The grass deadens one's steps," the Duke apologized. "Yes, and the birds scream so, and the wind. I'm afraid I startled you." "Oh, no, I didn't suppose the place belonged to me." She continued to scrutinize him gravely, and he wondered whether a certain fearless gravity were not what he liked best in women. Then suddenly she smiled, and he changed his mind. "But I've seen you before, haven't I?" she exclaimed. "I'm sure I have. Wasn't it at Runnymede?" "At Runnymede?" he stammered, his heart sinking. The smile, then, had after all been for the Duke. "Yes, I'm Nan St. George. My mother and Mrs. Elmsworth have taken a little cottage there. Lady Church's cottage? I have an idea you came one day, didn't you? I know, you're Mr. Robinson." His face must have betrayed his embarrassment, for she exclaimed, "Oh, then you're not Mr. Robinson? I'm so sorry. But won't you tell me your name?" There was no help for it. He had to drag himself into the open. "My name's Tintagel." Nan's eyebrows rose in surprise, and her smile enchanted him again. "Oh, but how perfectly splendid! Then of course you know Miss Testvalley." The Duke stared. He had never seen exactly that effect produced by the announcement of his name. "Miss Testvalley? Oh, don't you know her? How funny. But aren't you the brother of those girls whose governess she was? They used to live at Tintagel." "She knows me only as their brother," the Duke thought. "Or else," he added, "she knows who I am and doesn't care." At first, neither alternative was wholly pleasing, but after a moment's reflection, he felt a glow of relief. "I remember my sisters had a governess they were devoted to," he said, with timid affability. "I should think so. She's perfectly splendid. Did you know she was Dante Gabriele Rossetti's own cousin? Don't you love his poetry?" Well, the fact is, I've very little time to read poetry," the Duke faltered. Nan looked at him incredulously. "It doesn't take much time if you really care for it." To bring the talk back to an easier level, the Duke said, "You're staying in the neighborhood?" "Yes, at Trevennick, at the inn. I love it here, don't you? Well, you must live somewhere near here, I suppose." "Yes," the Duke said. His place wasn't above 3 miles away. Nan turned back to the rampart for a last look at the sea, but the deepening fog had blotted out everything. "I must really go," she said, "or I'll never find my way down." "If you'll allow me, may I see you back to Trevennick?" "Oh, I wish you would, if it's not too far out of your way." It's on my way," the Duke declared, lying hurriedly, and they started down the steep declivity. He had never before met a young lady alone in a ruined castle, and his mind, nurtured on precedents, had no rule to guide it. But nature cried aloud in him that he must somehow see her again. He was still turning over the best means of effecting another meeting when, after a slippery descent from the ruins and an arduous climb up the opposite cliff, they reached the fork of the path where it joined the lane to Trevennick. "Thank you so much, but you needn't come any further. There's the inn just below," the young lady said, smiling. "Oh, really? You'd rather... Well, mayn't I?" She shook her head. No, really." She mimicked him lightly, and with a quick wave of dismissal, she started down the lane. Just where the descent took a turn toward the village, Nan encountered a familiar figure panting upward. "Oh, Annabelle," said Miss Testvalley, "I've been hunting for you everywhere." Annabelle laughed and embraced her. "Well, you weren't expected back so soon. You promised me faithfully that you'd stay in the garden, and in this drenching fog." "Yes, but the fog blew away after you'd gone, and I thought that let me off my promise. So I scrambled up to the castle. There was a gentleman there who brought me back. Why, there he is still, at the top of the lane, where I left him. I suppose he's been watching to see that I got home safely. Don't you call that sweet of him?" Miss Testvalley released herself from her pupil's arm. Her eyes were not only keen, but far-sighted. They followed Nan's glance and rested on the figure of a young man who stood above them on the edge of the cliff. As she looked, he turned slowly away. "Annabelle, are you sure that was the gentleman?" "Yes. He's funny. He says he has no time to read poetry. What do you suppose he does instead?" "But it's the Duke of Tintagel," Miss Testvalley suddenly exclaimed. "The Duke? That young man?" It was Nan's turn to give an incredulous laugh. "Well, I think he's one of the stupidest young men I ever met." "Well," rejoined her governess severely, "I hope he thinks nothing worse than that of you." The Mr. Robinson, for whom Nan St. George had mistaken the Duke of Tintagel, was a young man much more confident of his gifts and assured as to his future than that retiring nobleman. His father, old Sir Downman Robinson, had built up one of the biggest cotton industries in Lancashire, and had been rewarded with a knighthood, and Sir Downman's only son meant to turn the knighthood into a baronetcy and the baronetcy into a peerage. All in good time. Meanwhile, as a partner in his father's big company, and director in various city enterprises, and as a Conservative MP for one of the last rotten boroughs in England, he had his work cut out for him, and could boast that his 35 years had not been idle ones. On a breathless August afternoon, Mr. Robinson had come down from London, as he did on most Saturdays, and joined the party about the tea table under the big cedar. The group was smaller than usual. Miss March was away visiting friends in the Lake Country. Nan St. George was still in Cornwall with her governess. Mrs. St. George and Mrs. Elmsworth, exhausted by the heat, had retired to the seclusion of their bedrooms, and only Virginia St. George and the two Elmsworth girls, under the doubtful chaperonage of Lady Richard Marrable, sat around the table with their usual guests, Lord Seddon, Santos Dias, Hector Robinson, a couple of young soldiers from Windsor, and a caustic young civil servant, the Honourable Miles Dornley. Mr. Robinson by this time felt quite at home among them. He agreed with the others that it was far too hot to play tennis or even croquet, or to go on the river before sunset, and he lay contentedly on the turf under the cedar, thinking his own thoughts and making his own observations. Of observations there were always plenty to be made at Runnymede. It was obvious, for instance, that Miles Dornley was head over ears in love with Conchita Marrable, and that she was playing him indolently and amusedly, for want of a bigger fish. But the neuralgic point in the group was the growing rivalry between Lizzie Elmsworth and Virginia St. George. Those two inseparable friends were gradually becoming estranged, and the reason was not far to seek. It was between them now, in the person of Lord Seddon, who lay at their feet, plucking up tufts of clover and gazing silently skyward through the dark boughs of the cedar. It had for some time been clear to Robinson that the susceptible young man was torn between Virginia St. George's exquisite profile and Lizzie Elmsworth's active wit. He needed the combined stimulus of both to rouse his slow imagination, and Robinson saw that while Virginia had the advantage as yet, it might at any moment slip into Lizzie's quick fingers, and Lizzie saw this too. A figure approached across the lawn.
"Darling Edina, what a surprise!"
"Oh, Conchita, dearest, I'd no idea I should find you here. Won't you explain me, please, to these young ladies? My tenants, I suppose?" Lady Chert swept the group with her cool, amused glance, which paused curiously, and, as Robinson thought, somewhat anxiously, on Virginia St. George's radiant face. She looks older than in her photographs, and hunted somehow, Robinson reflected, his own gaze resting on Lady Chert. "I'm Lady Chert, your landlady, you know," the speaker continued affably, addressing herself to Virginia and Lizzie. "Oh, please don't let me interrupt this delightful party. Mayn't I join it instead? What a brilliant idea to have tea out here in hot weather. I always used to have it on the terrace. Oh, but you Americans are so clever at arranging things." She looked about her, mustering the group with her fixed, metallic smile. With the exception of Hector Robinson, the young men were evidently all known to her, and she found an easy word of greeting for each. Lord Seddon was the last she named. "Ah, Seddon. So, you're here too. Now I see why you forgot you were lunching with me in town today. I must say you chose the better part." She dropped into the deep basket chair which Teddy Santos Dias had pushed forward, and held out her hand for a proffered mint julep. "No tea, thanks. Not when one of Teddy's demoralizing mixtures is available. You see, I know what to expect when I come here. A cigarette, Seddon? I hope you've got my special supply with you, even if you've forgotten our engagement." She smiled again upon the girls. "He spoils me horribly, you know, by always remembering to carry about my particular brand." Seddon, with flushed face and lowering brow, produced the packet, and Lady Chert slipped the contents into her cigarette case. "I do hope I'm not interrupting some delightful plan or other. Perhaps you were all going out on the river? If you were, you mustn't let me delay you, for I must be off again in a few minutes." Everyone protested that it was much too hot to move, and Lady Chert continued, "Oh, really? You had no plans? Well, it is pleasanter here than anywhere else. But perhaps I'm dreadfully in the way. Seddon's looking at me as if I were." She turned her glance laughingly towards Virginia St. George. "The fact is, I'm not at all sure that landladies have a right to intrude on their tenants unannounced. I dare say it's really against the law." "Well, if it is, you must pay the penalty by being detained at our pleasure," said Lady Richard gaily. As she spoke, she turned to her brother. "Come, Teddy,
If everybody's had tea, what about lifting the tray and things onto the grass and putting the table to its real use?
Two of the young men sprang to her aid, and in a moment tray and tea-cloth had been swept away, and the green baize top of the folding table had declared its original purpose.
Cards!
Oh, how jolly! Cried Lady Chert. She drew a seat up to the table, while Teddy de Santos Diaz, who had disappeared into the house, hurried back with a handful of packs. But this is glorious! Oh, no wonder my poor little cottage has become so popular. What? Poker? Oh, by all means. The only game worth playing. I took my first lesson from Seddon last week. Oh, Seddon, will you come to my rescue? Lend me a fiver, there's a darling. I hope I'm not going to lose more than that. Lord Seddon, who, since her arrival, had maintained a look of gloomy detachment, drew forth his note-case with an embarrassed air. She received it with a laugh. What? Carte blanche? What munificence! But let me see. She took up the note-case, ran her fingers through it, and drew out 2 or 3 £5 notes. Heavens, Seddon, what wealth! How am I ever going to pay you back if I lose? Or even if I win, when I need so desperately every penny I can scrape together. The card players, laughing, settled themselves about the table. Lady Chert and Lady Richard sat on opposite sides. Lord Seddon took a seat next to his sister-in-law, and the other men disposed themselves as they pleased. Robinson, who did not care to play, had casually placed himself behind Lady Chert, and the 3 girls, resisting a little banter and entreaty, declared that they also preferred to walk about and look on at the players. The game began in earnest, and Lady Chert opened with the supernaturally brilliant hand which often falls to the lot of the novice. The stakes, the observant Robinson noticed, were higher than usual, the players consequently more intent. It was one of those afternoons when thunder invisibly amasses itself behind the blue, and as the sun dropped slowly westward, it seemed as though the card table under the cedar boughs was overhung by the same feverish hush as the sultry lawns and airless river. Lady Chert's luck did not hold. Too quickly elated, she dashed ahead toward disaster. Robinson was not long in discovering that she was too emotional for a game based on dissimulation, and no match for such seasoned players as Lady Richard and her brother. Though her purse had evidently been better supplied than she pretended, the time at length came when it was nearly empty. But at that very moment her luck turned again. Robinson could not believe his eyes. The hand she held could hardly be surpassed. She understood enough of the game to seize her opportunity and fling her last notes into the jackpot. There was more money in the jackpot than Robinson had ever seen on the Runnymede card table, and a certain breathlessness pervaded the scene, as if the weight of the thundery sky were in the lungs of the players. Lady Chert threw down her hand and leaned back with a sparkle of triumph in eyes and lips. But Miles Dornley, with an almost apologetic gesture, had spread his cards upon the table. "Begorra, a royal flush!" a young Irish lieutenant gasped out. For a short interval of perplexity, Lady Chert was silent. Then the explanations of the other players brought home to her the shock of her disaster. She pushed back her chair, nearly colliding with the attentive Robinson. She tried to laugh. "Well, I've learnt my lesson. I'm completely ruined. Down and out, as I believe you say in the States. I'm afraid you're all too clever for me, and one of the young ladies had better take my place," she added with a drawn smile. Miles Dornley glanced across the table at Lizzie Elmsworth, who stood beside Hector Robinson, her keen eyes bent on the game. "Come, Miss Elmsworth, if Lady Chert is really deserting us, won't you replace her?" Lizzie shook her head, declaring that she and her friends were completely ignorant of the game. "What, even Virginia?" Conchita laughed. "There's no excuse for her, at any rate, for her father is a celebrated poker player." Virginia coloured at the challenge, but Lizzie, always quicker on the uptake, intervened before she could answer. "Why, you seem to have forgotten, Conchita, that girls don't play cards for money in America." Lady Chert turned slowly toward Virginia St. George, who was standing behind her. "No, I understand the game you young ladies play has fewer risks and requires only 2 players," she said, fixing her vivid eyes on the girl's bewildered face. For a moment Virginia's bewilderment was shared by the others about the table.
but Conchita hastily assumed the air of one who is vainly struggling to repress a burst of ill-timed mirth. "Oh, how frightfully funny you are, Edina. I do wish you wouldn't make me laugh so terribly in this hot weather." Lady Chert's colour rose angrily. "I'm glad it amuses you to see your friends lose their money," she said. "But unluckily I can't afford to make the fun last much longer." "Oh, nonsense, darling. Of course your luck will turn. Sit down again, do. Why should you hurry away? If you'll only stop and dine, you'll have an army of heroes to see you back to town. And sit down society at the dinner?" The effect of this was to make Lady Chert whiten with anger under her paint. She glanced sharply from Lady Richard to Lord Seaton. "Yes, do, Edina," Lord Seaton at length found voice to say. Lady Chert threw back her brilliant head with another laugh. "Thanks a lot for your invitation, Conchita, darling, and for yours too, Seaton. It's really rather amusing to be asked to dine in one's own house. But today I'm afraid I can't. I've got to carry you back to London with me, Seaton. But the fact is," she turned another of her challenging glances on Virginia St. George, "the fact is, Seaton, it's time your hostesses found out that you don't go with the house. At least not when I'm not living in it. That ought to have been explained to them, perhaps." "Edina," Lord Seaton muttered in anguish. "Oh, I'm not blaming anybody. It's such a natural mistake. Lord Seaton comes down here so continually when I'm here," Lady Chert pursued, her eyes still on Virginia's burning face, "that I suppose he simply forgot the house was let and went on coming from the mere force of habit. I do hope, Miss St. George, his being here hasn't inconvenienced you. Come along, Seaton, or we'll miss our train. And please excuse yourself to these young ladies who may think your visits were made on their account. Mayn't they?" A startled silence followed. Virginia's head was high, her cheeks burning, her blue eyes dark with indignation. Mr. Robinson, intently following the scene, wondered whether it were possible for a young creature to look more proud and beautiful. But in another moment he found himself reversing his judgment. For Mr. Robinson was all for action, and suddenly, swiftly, the other beauty, Virginia's friend and rival, had flung herself into the fray. "Virginia, what are you waiting for? Don't you see that Lord Seaton has no right to speak till you do? Why don't you tell him at once he has your permission to announce your engagement?" Lizzie Elmsworth cried with angry fervour. "By Jove," Mr. Robinson murmured to himself. She knew she hadn't much of a chance with Seaton, and quick as lightning she decided to back up the other girl against the common enemy. His own admiration, which, like Seaton's, had hitherto wavered between the two beauties, was transferred in a flash, and once and for all, to Lizzie. Virginia St. George still stood uncertain, her blue entreating eyes turned with a sort of terror on Lady Chert. "Seaton," the latter repeated with an angry smile. The sound of his name seemed to rouse the tardy suitor. He lifted his head and his gaze met Virginia's and detected her tears. He flushed to his pale eyebrows. This is all a mistake, a complete mistake. I mean," he stammered, turning to Virginia. "It's just a joke of Lady Chert's, who's such an old friend of mine that I know she'll want to be the first to congratulate me. If you'll only tell her that she may." The cottage at Runnymede stood dumb and deserted-looking as the Duke of Tintagel drove up to it. The two mothers he knew were in London, with the prospective bride and her friends Lizzie and Mab, who were, of course, to be among her bridesmaids. The Duke was perfectly aware that he should find neither Mrs. St. George nor her elder daughter at Runnymede, but he was not in quest of either. Now the whole aspect of the place was changed. The house seemed empty. The bright awnings were gone, and a cold grey mist hung in the cedar boughs and hid the river. The mist reminded the Duke of the day when, in the fog-swept ruins of Tintagel, he had come on the young lady whom it had been his exquisite privilege to guide back to Trevennick. He had called at the inn the next day, to reintroduce himself to the young lady's governess, and to invite them both to the new Tintagel, and for a fortnight his visits to the inn at Trevennick, and theirs to the ducal seat, had been frequent and protracted. But though he had spent with them long hours which had flown like minutes, He had never got beyond saying to himself, "I shan't rest till I've found an English girl exactly like her." And to be sure of not mistaking the copy, he had continued his study of the original. The bell rung by the Duke tinkled languidly and long before a flurried maid appeared. Mrs. St. George and Mrs. Elmsworth were up in town. Yes, he knew that, but might he perhaps see Miss Testvalley? The dazzled maid curtsied him into the drawing-room and rushed up to tell the governess. "Did you tell His Grace that Miss Annabelle was in London too?" Miss Testvalley asked. "No," the maid replied, "but His Grace had not asked for Miss Annabelle." "Ah," murmured the governess. She knew her man well enough by this time to be aware that this looked serious. "It was me he asked for?" And the maid, evidently sharing her astonishment, declared that it was. "I'm so sorry, Your Grace," Miss Testvalley said as she entered the drawing-room a moment later, "that there's no one here to receive you. I suppose the maid told you that our two ladies have taken a house in town to prepare for Miss St. George's wedding." "Yes, I've heard of that," said the Duke, almost solemnly. He cast an anxious glance about him, as if in search of something, and Miss Testvalley thought it proper to add, "And your young friend Annabelle has gone to London with her sister." "Ah," said the Duke laboriously. "The wedding is to take place soon?" "Very soon, in about a month." There was a heavy silence before the Duke continued. "And does Mrs. St. George intend to remain in London, or will she take a house in the country?" "Oh, neither. After the wedding, Mrs. St. George will go to her own house in New York." The Duke hesitated. "And Miss Annabelle?" "Naturally goes home with her parents. They wish her to have a season in New York." This time the silence closed in so oppressively that it seemed as though it had literally buried her visitor. Miss Testvalley felt an impulse to dig him out, but repressed it. At length the Duke spoke in a hoarse, unsteady voice. "You must have seen, Miss Testvalley. It has been a long struggle, but I've decided—" "Yes?" "To ask Miss Annabelle St. George—" Miss Testvalley's heart was stirred with an odd mixture of curiosity and sympathy. She really liked the Duke, but could Annabelle ever be brought to like him? "And so I came down today, in the hope of consulting with you—" Miss Testvalley interrupted him. "Duke, I must remind you that arranging marriages for my pupils is not included in my duties. If you wish to speak to Mrs. St. George—" "Oh, but I don't!" exclaimed the Duke. He looked so startled that for a moment she thought he was about to turn and take flight. It would have been a relief to her if he had, but he coughed nervously, cleared his throat, and began again. "I've always understood that in America it was the custom to speak first to the young lady herself, and knowing how fond you are of Miss St. George, I merely wished to ask if you had any idea whether her feelings in any degree correspond with mine," faltered the anxious suitor. Miss Testvalley pondered. What should she say? What could she say? What did she really wish to say? She could not at that moment have answered any of these questions. She knew only that, as life suddenly pressed closer to her charge, her impulse was to catch her fast and hold her tight. "I can't reply to that, Your Grace. I can only say that I don't know." "You don't know?" repeated the Duke in surprise. "Nan, in some ways, is still a child. She judges many things as a child would." "Yes, that's what I find so interesting. So unusual." "Exactly. But it makes your question unanswerable. How can one answer for a child who can't yet answer for herself? I advise you to wait, to give her time to grow up." "Oh, but I can't wait," cried the Duke, in the astonished tone of the one who has never before been obliged to. Miss Testvalley smiled. "I'm afraid you must say that to Annabelle herself, not to me." "Well, I thought you were my friend. I hoped you'd advise me." "You don't want me to advise you, Duke. You want me to agree with you." The Duke considered this for some time without speaking. Then he said, "I suppose you've no objection to giving me the London address?" And the governess wrote it down for him with her same disciplined smile. The windows of the Correggio room at Longlands overlooked what was known as the Duchess's private garden. Beyond an elaborate cast-iron fountain swarmed over by chaste divinities and surrounded by stars and crescents of bedding plants, an archway in the wall of yew and holly led down a grass avenue to the autumnal distances of the home park. It had rained heavily in the morning, and the Duchess, at the window, stood gazing out over what seemed a measureless perspective of rain-sodden acres. Then, with a sigh, she turned back to the writing-table and took up her pen. A sheet of paper lay before her, carefully inscribed in a small, precise hand. To a Dowager Duchess, to a Duchess, to a Marchioness, to the wife of a cabinet minister who has no rank by birth, to the wife of a bishop, to an ambassador. The page was inscribed "Important," and under each headline was a brief formula for beginning and ending a letter. The Duchess scrutinized this paper attentively. Then she glanced over another paper bearing a list of names, and finally, with a sigh, took from a tall mahogany stand a sheet of notepaper with Longlands House engraved in gold under a ducal coronet, and began to write. After each note she struck a pencil line through one of the names on the list, and then began another note. Each was short, but she wrote slowly, almost laboriously, like a conscientious child copying out an exercise. And at the bottom of the sheet she inscribed her name, Annabelle Tintagel. Annabelle Tintagel, she said slowly. Who is Annabelle Tintagel? The question was one which she had put to herself more than once during the last months, and the answer was always the same. She did not know. She was now, to all appearances, Annabelle Tintagel, and had been so for over 2 years. But before that she had been Annabelle St. George, and the figure of Annabelle St. George, her face and voice, her likes and dislikes, her memories and moods, all that made up her tremulous little identity, though still at the new Annabelle's side, no longer composed the central Annabelle, the being with whom this strange new Annabelle of the Correggio room at Longlands and the Duchess's private garden felt herself really one. There were moments when the vain hunt for her real self became so perplexing and disheartening that she was glad to escape from it into the mechanical duties of her new life. But in the intervals she continued to grope for herself, and to find no one. The curious thing was that her uncertainty and confusion of mind seemed to have communicated themselves to the new world into which she found herself transplanted. Fashionable London had assimilated with surprising rapidity the lovely transatlantic invaders. Hostesses, who only 2 years ago would have shuddered at the clink of tall glasses and the rattle of cards, now threw their doors open to poker parties and offered intoxicating drinks to those to whom the new-fangled afternoon tea seemed too reminiscent of the schoolroom. Girls, and even young matrons, pinned up their skirts to compete with the young men in the new game of lawn tennis on lordly lawns. Smoking was spreading from the precincts reserved for it to dining room and library. It was even rumoured that the Americans took sly whiffs in their bedrooms. But the young Duchess of Tintagel remained a figure apart. In the circle where the pace was set by Conchita Marrable, Virginia Seadown, and Lizzie Elmsworth, now married to the brilliant young Conservative Member of Parliament, Mr. Hector Robinson, the circle to which, by kinship and early associations, Annabelle belonged, she was as much a stranger as in the straightest fastness of the peerage. The first months after her marriage had been spent at Tintagel, in a solitude deeply disapproved of by the Duke's mother, who, for the second time, found herself powerless to influence her son. Those quiet months in Cornwall had been of Annabelle's own choosing. She did not admit to herself that her first sight of the ruins of the ancient Tintagel had played a large part in her wooing, that if the Duke had only been the dullest among the amiable but dull young men who came to the bungalow at Runnymede, she would hardly have given him a second thought. But the idea of living in that magic castle by the sad western sea had secretly tinged her vision of the castle's owner, and she had thought that he and she might get to know each other more readily there than anywhere else. And now, in looking back, she asked herself if it were not her own fault that the weeks at Tintagel had not brought the expected understanding. Instead, as she now saw, they had only made husband and wife more unintelligible to each other. It had filled Annabelle with wonder to learn that for miles around, both at Longlands and Tintagel, all the people in the quaint damp cottages and the stuffy little shops were her husband's tenants and dependents. But when she had grasped the extent of his power, it seemed to her that to help and befriend those who depended on him was the best service she could render him. The discovery that her interest in them was distasteful to the Duke came to her as a great shock, and left a wound that did not heal. Coming in one day, a few months after their marriage, from one of her exploring expeditions, she was told that His Grace wished to speak to her in his study, and she went in eagerly, glad to seize the chance of telling him at once about the evidence of neglect and poverty she had come across that very afternoon. "Oh, Ushant, I'm so glad you're in. Could you come with me at once to the Linfrey's cottage down by St. Gilda's? You know, that damp little place under the bridge, with the front covered with roses? The eldest boy's down with typhoid, and the drains ought to be seen to at once if all the younger ones are not to get it." She spoke in haste, too much engrossed in what she had to say to notice the Duke's expression. It was his silence that roused her, and when she looked at him, she saw that his face wore what she called its bolted look, the look she most disliked to see on it. "May I ask you who told you this?" he asked at length. "Why, I found it out myself. I've just come from there." "You've been there, yourself? To a house where you tell me there is typhoid fever? In your state of health?" "I confess, Annabelle." His lips twitched nervously under his scanty blonde moustache. "But, Ushant, I had to. There was no one there to see about them. And if the house reeks with disease, whose fault is it but ours? They've no sick nurse and nobody to help the mother or tell her what to do. And the doctor comes only every other day. And the drains, Ushant, you must come with me at once and smell the drains," cried Nan in a passion of entreaty. She felt the Duke's inexpressive eyes fixed coldly on her. "Won't you come with me now? The ponies are not a bit tired, and I told William to wait." "I wish you would not call Armson by his Christian name. I've already told you that in England head grooms are called by their surnames." The Duke walked to the hearth and pulled the embroidered bell-rope beside the chimney. To the footman who appeared, he said, "Please tell Armson that Her Grace will not require the pony chaise any longer this afternoon." "But—" Annabelle burst out. Then she stood silent till the door closed on the servant. The Duke remained silent also. "Is that your answer?" she asked at length, her breath coming quickly. He lifted a more friendly face. "My dear child, don't look so tragic. I'll see Blair. He'll look into the drains. But do try to remember that these small matters concern my agent more than they do me, and that they don't concern you at all." Annabelle stood staring at her husband without speaking. Suddenly a flood of words burst from her. "You tell me to be careful about my health in the very same breath that you say you can't be bothered about these poor people, and that their child's dying is a small matter, to be looked after by an agent. It's for the sake of your own child that you forbid me to go to see them. But I tell you, I don't want a child if he's to be brought up with such ideas, if he's to be taught as you've been that it's right and natural to live in a palace with 50 servants and not care for the people who are slaving for him on his own land to make his big income bigger. I'd rather be dead than see a child of mine taught to grow up as you have." She broke down and dropped into a seat, hiding her face in her hands. Her husband looked at her without speaking. Had Annabelle gone mad? Or was it only what the doctors called her condition? At any rate, he must try to propitiate her, and as soon as possible take her back to Longlands, where she would be nearer a London physician, accustomed to bringing dukes into the world. "Annabelle," he said, going up to her and laying his hand on her bent head. She started to her feet. "Let me alone!" she exclaimed, and brushed past him to the door. He heard her cross the hall and go up the stairs in the direction of her own rooms. Annabelle did not reappear that afternoon, and when the Duke, on his way up to dress for dinner, knocked at her sitting-room door, she was not there. He went on to his own dressing-room, but on the way met his wife's maid, and asked if Her Grace were already dressing. "Oh, no," the maid said. "Her Grace had gone out on foot 2 or 3 hours ago, and had not yet returned." "On foot?" "Yes, your Grace. I understand she sent to the stables, and, finding she could not have a carriage, walked away through the park." "That'll do. There's been some unfortunate misunderstanding about Her Grace's orders," stammered the Duke, turning away to his dressing-room. The day had been raw and cloudy, and with the dusk rain had begun and was coming down now in a heavy pour. And in this his wife, his Duchess, the expectant mother of future dukes, was wandering somewhere on foot, alone and unprotected. Anger and alarm contended in the Duke. He rang and ordered Bowman to send to the stables for the carriage, and when it arrived he drove down at breakneck speed to the Linfrys' cottage. But Nan was not there. The Duke stared at Mrs. Linfrey blankly. He did not know where to go next, and it mortified him to reveal his distress and uncertainty to the coachman. "Home," he ordered angrily, getting into the carriage again, and the dark drive began once more. He was halfway back when the carriage stopped with a jerk, and the coachman, scrambling down from the box, called to him in a queer, frightened voice. The Duke jumped out and saw the man lifting a small, dripping figure. "By the mercy of God, your Grace, I think the Duchess has fainted." "Drive like the devil. Stop at the stables to send a groom for the doctor," stammered the Duke, pressing his wife in his arms. The rest of the way back was as indistinct to him as to the girl who lay so white on his breast. Bowed over her in anguish, he remembered nothing till the carriage drove under the echoing gate tower at Tintagel, and lights and servants pressed confusedly about them. He lifted Annabelle out, and she opened her eyes and took a few steps across the hall. "Oh, am I here again?" she said, with a little laugh. Then she swayed forward, and he caught her as she fell. To the Duchess of Tintagel, who was signing the last notes of invitation to the first big shooting party of the season at Longlands, the scene at Tintagel and what had followed now seemed as remote and legendary as the tales that clung about the old ruins of Arthur's castle. Annabelle had put herself hopelessly in the wrong. She had understood it without being told. She had acknowledged it, and wept over it at the time. But the irremediable had been done, and she knew that never in her husband's eyes would any evidence of repentance atone for that night's disaster. The miscarriage, which had resulted from her mad expedition through the storm, had robbed the Duke of a son. Of that he was convinced. He, the Duke of Tintagel, wanted a son. He had a right to expect a son. He would have had a son if this woman's criminal folly had not destroyed his hopes. As far as words went, the Duke had forgiven his wife. They had left the solitude of Tintagel as soon as the physicians thought it possible for the Duchess to be moved, and now, in their crowded London life and at Longlands, the ducal pair were too busy, too deeply involved in the incessant distractions and obligations of their station, to have time to remember what was over, and could not be mended. Annabelle gradually learned that it was not only oneself that changed. The ceaseless, mysterious flow of days wore down and altered the shape of the people nearest one, so that one seemed fated to always be a stranger among strangers. The mere fact, for instance, of Annabel St. George becoming Annabel Tintagel had turned her mother-in-law, the Duchess of Tintagel, into a Dowager Duchess, over whose diminished head the mighty roof of Longlands had shrunk into the modest shelter of a lovely little rose-clad dower house at the gates of the park. And everyone else, as far as Annabelle's world reached, seemed to have changed in the same way. What relation, say, did the Conchita Clausen, who had once seemed so ethereal and elusive, bear to Lady Dick Marrable, beautiful still, though she was growing rather too stout, but who had lost her lovely indolence and detachment, and was now perpetually preoccupied about money, and immersed in domestic difficulties and clandestine consolations? What relation did Virginia, her own sister Virginia, who had seemed to Annabelle so secure, so aloof, so disdainful of everything but her own pleasures, bear to Lady Seddon, enslaved to that dull, half-asleep Seddon, absorbed in questions of rank and precedence? Annabelle roused herself from these vain musings and took up her pen. A final glance at the list had shown her that one invitation had been forgotten. Or if not forgotten, at least postponed. Dear Mr. Thwart, the Duke tells me that you have lately come back to England, and he hopes so much that you can come to Longlands for our next shooting party on the 18th. He asks me to say that he is anxious to have a talk with you about the situation at Loudon. He hopes you intend to stand if Sir Hercules Loft is obliged to resign, and wishes you to know that you will have his full support. Yours sincerely, Annabelle Tintagel. Underneath she added, P.S. Perhaps you'd remember me if I signed Nan St. George.
But what was the sense of that, when there was no longer anyone of that name? She tore the note up and rewrote it without adding the postscript. The little Duchess's note had evoked no very clear memory when Guy Thwart first read it, but as he wandered down the glen through the fading heath and bracken, he suddenly recalled their walk along the same path in its summer fragrance, and how they had stayed alone on the terrace of Honourslove when the rest of the party followed Sir Helmsley through the house. They had leaned side by side on the balustrade, he remembered, looking out over that dear scene, and speaking scarcely a word. And yet, when she had gone, he knew how near they had been. And then he had heard, with wonder and incredulity, the rumour of her ducal marriage, a rumour speedily confirmed by letters and newspapers from home. For a few weeks the news had blackened Guy's horizon, but he was far away. He was engrossed in labours and pleasures so remote from his earlier life that the girl's pale image had become etherealized, and then had faded out of existence. He sat down on the balustrade of the terrace, in the corner where they had stood together, and pulling out her little note, reread it. The writing of a schoolgirl, and the language of dictation, he thought, and the idea vaguely annoyed him. How on earth could she have married Tintagel? That girl. One would think from the wording of her note that she'd never seen me before. She might at least have reminded me that she'd been here. But perhaps she'd forgotten. As I had, he ended with a laugh and a shrug. When their graces were in residence at Longlands, the Dowager did not often come up from the dower house by the gate, but at Christmas she naturally could not remain aloof. For the same reason the new Duchess's family and her American friends had also to be invited, or at least so the Duke thought. The Dowager was not of the same mind. "It does seem odd, Ushant's wanting all these strange people here for Christmas," she confided to her friend Miss March. The two ladies had seated themselves after dinner at one end of the double-cube saloon. The floor had been cleared of rugs and furniture, another shock this to the Dowager, and the two long rows facing each other, ladies on one side of the room, gentlemen opposite, had broken up, and 2 by 2, in dancing pairs, forming a sort of giant caterpillar, were spinning off down the saloon and all the length of the Waterloo room adjoining it, and the Raphael drawing-room beyond, in the direction of the Classical Sculpture Gallery. Down the upper gallery spun the accelerated reel, song and laughter growing longer to the accompaniment of hurrying feet. Teddy DeSantis Diaz had started John Peel, and one hunting song followed on another in rollicking chorus. Door after door was flung open, whirled through, and passed out of again, as the train pursued its turbulent way. Now and then a couple fell out, panting and laughing, to join the line again when it coiled back upon itself. But the Duchess and Guy Thwart did not rejoin it. Annabelle had sunk down on a bench at the door of the Correggio room. Guy Thwart stood at her side, leaning against the wall and looking down at her. He thought how becomingly the dance had flushed her cheeks and tossed her hair. The door of the Correggio room stood wide as the dance swept on, and he glanced in and saw the candle-lit walls and the sunset glow of the pictures. By Jove, there are the Correggios. Annabelle stood up. "Well, you know them, I suppose." "Well, rather, but I'd forgotten they were in here." "In my sitting room. Come and look. They're so mysterious in this faint light." He followed her and stood before the pictures, his blood beating high, as it always did at the sight of beauty. In the pale amber candle glow they seemed full of mystery, as though withdrawn into their own native world of sylvan loves and revels. And for a while he too was absorbed into that world, and almost unconscious of his companion's presence. When at last he turned, he saw that her face had lost the glow of the dance, and had become small and wistful, as he had seen it on the day of his arrival at Longlands. "You're right. They're even more magical than by daylight." "Yes. I often come here when it's getting dark, and I sit among them without making a sound. Perhaps some day, if I'm very patient, I'll tame them and they'll come down to me." Guy Thwart stood looking at her. "They must make up to you for a great deal," he began imprudently, heedless of what he was saying. "For a good deal, yes. But it's rather lonely sometimes, when the only things that seem real are one's dreams."
The young man flushed up and made a movement toward her. Then he paused and looked at the pictures with a vague laugh. She was only a child, he reminded himself. She didn't measure what she was saying. Oh, well, you'll go to them some day, in their Italian palaces.
I don't think so. Ushant doesn't care for travelling. Guy was silent. He turned back to his study of the pictures. Has it ever occurred to you, he began again after a pause, that if you had the courage to sweep away all those touching little, family mementos, his gesture ranged across the closely covered walls, from illuminated views of Vesuvius in action to landscapes by the Dowager Duchess's great aunts, and photographs in heavy oak frames of ducal relatives, famous racehorses, bishops in lawn sleeves, and undergraduates grouped about sporting trophies. Annabelle coloured, but with amusement, not annoyance. Yes, it did occur to me, and one day I smuggled in a ladder and I took them all down. Every one. By Jove, you did. It must have been glorious. Yes, that was the trouble. The Duchess, my mother-in-law, was so shocked that every single picture I'd taken down had to be put back the same day. Oh, that's natural, too. We're built like that in this tight little island. We fight like tigers against change, and then one fine day accept it without arguing. You'll see. Ushant will come round, and then his mother will, because he has. It's only a question of time, and luckily you've plenty of that ahead of you. He looked at her as he spoke, conscious that he was not keeping the admiration out of his eyes, or the pity either, as he had meant to. Her own eyes darkened as she glanced away. Yes, there's plenty of time. Years and years of it. You don't complain of that, do you? I sometimes think I wasn't meant for this. She broke off, and he saw the tears in her eyes. If you knew what I'd give to be able to try again, somewhere where I could be myself, you understand? Not just an unsuccessful Duchess. Yes, I do understand. Annabelle? A voice called from the threshold, and Miss Testvalley stood before them, her small brown face full of discernment and resolution. My dear, the Duke's asking for you. Your guests are beginning to leave, and I must be off with Lady Glenlow and my girls. Laughing and talking, the three descended together to the great hall, where the departing guests were assembled. The house party at Longlands was not to break up for another week, but the morning after the Christmas festivities, such general lassitude prevailed that the long galleries and great drawing-rooms remained deserted till luncheon. After an interval of uneasy cogitation, the Dowager rang and sent to inquire if her daughter-in-law could receive her. The reply was that the Duchess was still asleep. At midday, the Dowager all her life had been called at 7:15, but that as soon as she awoke, she should be given her Grace's message. The luncheon hour was approaching when there was a knock on the Dowager's door, and Annabelle entered. "My dear, do come in. Sit here, you'll be more comfortable. I hope," continued the Duchess with a significant smile as she pushed forward a deep, easy chair, "that we shall soon have to be asking you to take care of yourself, not to commit any fresh imprudence." Annabelle, ignoring the suggestion, pulled up a straight-backed chair and seated herself opposite her mother-in-law. "I'm not at all tired," she declared. "Not consciously, perhaps, but all that wild dancing last night, and in fact into the small hours, must have been very exhausting." "Oh, I've had a good sleep since. It's nearly luncheon time, isn't it?" "Not quite, and I so seldom have a chance of saying a word to you alone that I want to tell you how much I hope, and Ushant hopes, that you won't run any more risks. I know it's not always easy to remember, but last night, for instance, from every point of view, it might have been better if you had remained at your post. When your guests were leaving, Ushant was naturally, surprised at having to hunt over the house for you." Annabelle looked at her thoughtfully. "Did he ask you to tell me so?" "No, but he thinks you don't realize how odd it must have seemed to your guests, that in the middle of a party you should have taken Mr. Thwart upstairs to your sitting-room. But we didn't go on purpose. We were following the reel, and I dropped out because I was tired. And as Mr. Thwart wanted to see the Correggios, I took him in."
That's the point, my dear. Guy Thwart ought to have known better. I don't know what your customs are in the States, but in England—" The Dowager broke off, as if waiting for an interruption which did not come. Annabelle remained silent, and her mother-in-law continued with gathering firmness, "In England, such behaviour might be rather severely judged." Annabelle's eyes widened, and she stood up with a slight smile. "I think I'm tired of trying to be English," she pronounced. The Dowager rose also, drawing herself up to her full height. "Trying to be? But you are English. When you became my son's wife, you acquired his nationality. Nothing can change that now." "Nothing?" "Nothing. Remember what you promised in the marriage service, to love and to obey till death us do part. Those are not words to be lightly spoken." "No, but I think I spoke them lightly. I made a mistake." "A mistake, my dear? What mistake?" Annabelle drew a quick breath. "Marrying you shan't," she said. The Dowager received this with a gasp. "My dear Annabelle." "No, I think it might be better if I left him. Then he could marry somebody else and have a lot of children. Wouldn't that be best?" Annabelle continued hurriedly. The Dowager, rigid with dismay, stood erect, her strong, plump hands grasping the rim of her writing-table. "If you can talk of your own feelings in that way, even in jest, do you take no account of Ushant's?" Annabelle looked at her musingly. "I don't think Ushant has very strong feelings. About me, I mean." The Dowager rejoined with some bitterness. "You have hardly encouraged him to, have you?" I don't know. I can't explain. I've told Ushant that I don't think I want to be the mother of dukes." "Well, you should have thought of that before becoming the wife of one. According to English law, you are bound to obey your husband implicitly in all such matters. But, Annabelle, we mustn't let our talk end in a dispute. My son would be very grieved if he thought I'd said anything to offend you, and I've not meant to. I know Ushant's great wish is to see you happy and contented in the lot he has offered you. A lot, my dear, that most young women would envy," the Dowager concluded, lifting her head with an air of wounded majesty. "Oh, I know. That's why I'm so sorry for my mistake." "Your mistake? But there's been no mistake. Your taking Guy Thwart up to your sitting-room was quite as much his fault as yours. And you need only show him, by a slightly more distant manner, that he is not to misinterpret it. I dare say less importance is attached to such things in your country, where there are no dukes, of course." "No, that's why I'd better go back there," burst from Annabelle. The Dowager looked at her in incredulous wrath. Really, it was beyond her powers of self-control to listen smilingly to such impertinence. Such blasphemy, she had almost called it. Ushant himself must stamp out this senseless rebellion. At that moment the luncheon gong sent its pompous call down the corridors, and at the sound the Duchess, hurriedly composing her countenance, passed a shaking hand over her neatly crimped bandeau. "The gong, my dear? You must not keep your guests waiting. I'll follow you at once." Annabelle turned obediently to the door, and went down to join the assembled ladies and the few men who were not out with the guns. That evening, before dinner, as Annabelle sat over her dressing-room fire, she heard a low knock, followed by a soft, hesitating turn of the door-handle. "Nan, dear, no dressing yet, I hope?" It was Conchita Marable, her tawny hair loosely tossed back, her plump shoulders draped in a rosy dressing-gown festooned with swansdown. Annabelle greeted her visitor with a smile. "Oh, darling, you're all alone? Ushant's not lurking anywhere?" she questioned, peering about the room with an air of mystery. Annabelle shook her head. "No, he doesn't often come here before dinner." "Then he's a very stupid man, my dear," Lady Dick rejoined, her smile resting approvingly on her hostess. "Do you know how awfully lovely you're growing? Oh, Nan, fancy having all you've got, the hair, the eyes, the rank, the power, and the money." Annabelle interrupted her. "Oh, but Conchita, I haven't got much money." Lady Dick's smiling face clouded, and her clear eyes grew dark. "Now why do you say that? Are you afraid of being asked to help an old friend in a tight place? And do you want to warn me off in advance?" Annabelle looked at her in surprise. "Oh, Conchita, what a beastly question. It doesn't sound a bit like you. Do sit down by the fire. You're shaking all over. Why, I believe you're crying." Annabelle put an arm around her friend's shoulder and drew her down into an armchair near the hearth, pulling up a low stool for herself and leaning against Lady Dick's knee with low sounds of sympathy. "Tell me, Conchi, darling, what's wrong?" "Oh, my child, pretty nearly everything." Drawing out a scrap of lace and cambric, Lady Dick applied it to her beautiful eyes, but the tears continued to flow, and Annabelle had to wait till they had ceased. Then Lady Dick, tossing back her tumbled curls, continued with a rainbow smile. "Oh, but what's the use? They're all things you wouldn't understand. What do you know about being head over ears in debt and in love with one man while you're tied to another, tied tight in one of these awful English marriages that strangle you in a noose when you try to pull away from them?" "Oh, Conchita," Nan murmured, flinging her arms about her friend's neck. She felt suddenly years older than Conchita, and mistress of the bitter law the latter fancied she was revealing to her. Since the tragic incident of the Linfrey's child's death, Annabelle had never asked her husband for money, and he had never informed himself if her requirements exceeded the modest allowance traditionally allotted to Tintagel duchesses. "Darling, can you tell me anything more? Of course I want to help you, but I must find out ways. I'm almost as much of a prisoner as you are, I fancy. Perhaps more, because Dick's away a good deal, isn't he?" "Oh, yes, almost always, but his duns are not. The bills keep pouring in. What little money there is mine, and of course those people know it. But I'm stone broke at present, and I don't know what I shall do if you can't help me with a loan." She drew back and looked at Nan beseechingly. "Oh, you don't know how I hate talking to you about such sordid things. You seem so high above it all, so untouched by anything bad." "But, Conchita, it's not bad to be unhappy." "Oh, no, darling. Goodness knows I am unhappy enough. But I suppose it's wrong to try to console myself in the way I have. Well, you must think so, I know. But I can't live without affection, and Miles is so understanding, so tender." Miles Dornley, then. 2 or 3 times Nan had wondered, had noticed things which seemed to bespeak a tender intimacy, but she had never been sure. The blood rushed to her forehead. "Well, my dear, which do you think is worse, having a lover or owing a few £100? Between the two I've shocked you hopelessly, haven't I?" Lady Dick stood up with a laugh, pushing her curls back into their loosened coil. Her face looked pale and heavy. "You haven't shocked me, only made me dreadfully sorry, because I don't know what I can do." "Oh, well, don't lie awake over it, my dear," Lady Dick retorted with a touch of bitterness. "But isn't that the dressing bell? I must hurry off and be laced into my dinner gown." "Conchita, wait!" Annabelle was trembling with the sense of having failed her friend and been unable to make her understand why. "Don't think I don't care. Oh, please don't think that. The way we live makes it look as if there wasn't a whim I couldn't gratify, but Ushant doesn't give me much money, and I don't know how to ask for it." Conchita turned back and gave her a long look. "The skinflint. No, I suppose he wouldn't. And I suppose you haven't yet learned to manage him." Annabelle blushed more deeply. "I'm not clever at managing, I'm afraid. You must give me time to look about, to find out." It had suddenly occurred to her, she hardly knew why, that Guy Thwart was the one person she could take into her confidence in such a matter. Perhaps he would be able to tell her how to raise the money for her friend. She would pluck up her courage and ask him the next day. "Conchi, dear, by tomorrow evening, I promise you," she began, and found herself instantly gathered to her friend's bosom. £200 would save my life, you darling, and 500 would make me a free woman." The next morning, Annabelle, after a restless night, stood at her window watching the dark return of day. She had gone over and over every possible plan for getting the £500. The idea of consulting Guy Thwart had faded before the first hint of daylight. Of course he would offer to lend her the sum, and how could she borrow from a friend money she saw no possibility of repaying? And yet to whom else could she apply? It was naturally to Ushant that his wife should turn in any financial difficulty, but Annabelle had never done so since the Linfrey incident, and though she knew the sum she wanted was nothing to a man with Ushant's income, she was as frightened as though she had been going to beg for the half of his fortune. When there was a big shooting party at Longlands, every hour of the Duke's day was disposed of in advance. After much reflection, she scribbled a note to him. "Please let me know after breakfast when I can see you." And to her surprise, when the party rose from the sumptuous repast which always fortified the guns at Longlands, the Duke followed her into the east drawing-room, where the ladies were accustomed to assemble in the mornings with their needlework and correspondence. "If you'll come to my study for a moment, Annabelle." "Now?" she stammered, not expecting so prompt a response. The Duke consulted his watch. "I have a quarter of an hour before we start." She hesitated, and then, reflecting that she might have a better chance of success if there were no time to prolong the discussion, rose and followed him. Ushant had seated himself behind his monumental desk, as if to borrow from it the authority he did not always know how to assert unaided. His wife stood before him without speaking. He lifted his head and forced one of the difficult smiles he had inherited from his mother. "Yes?" "Oh, Ushant, I don't know how to begin." "Well, my dear?" "Oh, you wouldn't understand, but what I've actually come for is to ask you to let me have £500. There, it was out. About as lightly as if she had hurled a rock at him through one of the tall windows. He frowned and looked down, picking up an emblazoned paper cutter to examine it. £500, he repeated slowly. "Yes." "Do I understand that you were asking me for that sum?" "Yes." There was another heavy silence, during which she strained her eyes to detect any change in his guarded face. There was none. £500. "Oh, please, Ushant, yes." "Now. At once." "At once," she faltered, feeling that each syllable of his slow interrogatory was draining away a drop of her courage. The Duke again attempted a smile. "It's a large sum." "A very large sum. Has your dressmaker led you on rather further than your means would justify?" Nan reddened. A dressmaker? She wondered if Ushant had ever noticed her clothes. But might he not be offering her the very pretext she needed? She hated having to use one, but since she could think of no other way of getting what she wanted, she resolved to surmount her scruples. "Well, you see, I've never known exactly what my means were, but I do want this money." "Never known what your means were? Surely it's all clearly enough written down in your marriage contract." "Yes, but sometimes one is tempted to spend a trifle more." "You must have been taught very little about the value of money to call £500 a trifle." Annabelle broke into a laugh. "Oh, you're teaching me a lot about it now." The Duke's temples grew red under his straw-coloured hair, and she saw that her stroke had gone home. "It is my duty to do so," he remarked dryly. Then his tone altered, and he said on a conciliatory note, "I hope you'll bear the lesson in mind. But of course, if you've incurred this debt, it must be paid." "Oh, Ushant!" He raised his hand to check her gratitude. "Naturally, if you'll please tell these people to send me their bill." He rose stiffly with another glance at his watch. "I said a quarter of an hour, and I'm afraid it's nearly up." Nan stood crestfallen between her husband and the door. "But you don't understand. I mean," she hurriedly corrected herself, "it's really no use your bothering. If you'll just make out the cheque to me, I'll—" The Duke stopped short. "Ah," he said slowly. "Then it's not to pay your dressmaker that you want it." Nan's quick colour flew to her forehead. "Well, no, it's not. I want it for my private charities." "Your private charities? Is your allowance not paid regularly? All your private expenditures are supposed to be included in it. My mother was always very satisfied with that arrangement." "Yes, but did your mother never have unexpected calls? Well, sometimes one has to help in an emergency. The two faced each other in a difficult silence. At length the Duke straightened himself and said with an attempt at ease, "I'm willing to admit that emergencies may arise, but if you ask me to advance £500 at a moment's notice, it's only fair that I should be told why you need it." Their eyes met, and a flame of resistance leapt into Nan's. "I've told you it's for a private charity." "My dear, there should be nothing private between husband and wife." She laughed impatiently. "Are you trying to say you won't give me the money?" "I'm saying quite the contrary. I'm ready to give it if you'll tell me what you want it for." "Oh, shan't. It's a long time since I've asked you a favour, and you can't go on forever ordering me about like a child." The Duke took a few steps across the room. Then he turned back. His complexion had faded to its usual sandy pallor, and his lips twitched a little. "Perhaps, my dear, you forget how long it is since I have asked you for a favour. I'm afraid you must make your choice. If I'm not, as you call it, to order you about like a child, you may force me to order you about as a wife." The words came out slowly, haltingly, as if they had cost him a struggle. "And now my time is up. I can't keep the guns waiting any longer," he concluded abruptly, turning towards the door. Annabelle stood silent. She could find nothing else to say. "You can't force me. No one can force me," she cried out suddenly, hardly knowing what she said, but her husband had already crossed the threshold, and she wondered whether the closing of the door had not drowned her words. She stood where the Duke had left her. Now she went out into the long vaulted passage on which the study opened. The passage was empty, and so was the great domed and pillared hall beyond. In the lobby of one of the side entrances, Annabelle found an old garden hat and cloak. She put them on and went out. The great house had become like a sepulchre to her. Under its ponderous cornices and cupolas, she felt herself reduced to a corpse-like immobility. It was only in the open that she became herself again, a stormy self, reckless and rebellious. Now, out of doors, under the lowering skies, she could breathe and even begin to think. But for the moment all her straining thoughts were arrested by the same insurmountable barrier. She was the Duchess of Tintagel, and knew no way of becoming anyone else. She walked across the gardens opening out from the west wing, and slowly mounted the wooded hillside beyond. It was beginning to rain, and she must find a refuge somewhere, a solitude in which she could fight out this battle between herself and her fate. The slope she was climbing was somewhat derisively crowned by an octagonal temple of love, with rain-streaked walls of peeling stucco. On the summit of the dome the neglected god spanned his bow unheeded, and underneath it a door swinging loose on broken hinges gave admittance to a room stored with the remnants of derelict croquet sets and disabled shuttlecocks and grace rings. Nan, certain of being undisturbed in this retreat, often came there with a book or writing materials, but she had not intruded on its mouldy solitude since the beginning of winter. As she entered, a chill fell on her, but she sat down at the stone table in the centre of the dilapidated mosaic floor and rested her chin on her arms. "I must think it all out," she said aloud, and closing her eyes, she tried to lose herself in an inner world of self-examination. But think out what? Once more she felt herself sinking into the depths of childish despair, one of those old benumbing despairs, without past or future, which used to blot out the skies when her father scolded her, or Miss Testvalley looked disapproving. Her face dropped into her hands, and she broke into sobs of misery. The sobs murmured themselves out, but for a long time she continued to sit motionless, her face hidden, with a child's reluctance to look out again on a world which had wounded it. Her back was turned to the door, and she was so sunk in her distress that she was unconscious of not being alone until she felt a touch on her shoulder and heard a man's voice. "Duchess, are you ill? What's happened?" She turned and saw Guy Thwart bending over her. "What is it? What has made you cry?" he continued in the compassionate tone of a grown person speaking to a frightened child. Nan jumped up, her wet handkerchief crumpled against her eyes. She felt a sudden anger at this intrusion. "Where did you come from? Why aren't you out with the guns?" she stammered. "I was to have been, but a message came from Loudon to say that Sir Hercules is worse, and Ushant has asked me to prepare some notes in case the election comes on sooner than we expected. So I wandered up the hill to clear my ideas a little." Nan stood looking at him with a growing sense of resentment. "Won't you tell me why you are crying?" he insisted gently. Her childish anger flamed. "I'm not crying," she retorted, hurriedly pushing her handkerchief into her pocket. "And I don't know why you should follow me here. You must see that I want to be alone." The young man drew back, surprised. Since the distant day of their first talk at Honourslove, he had felt between them the existence of a mysterious understanding, which every subsequent meeting had renewed, though in actual words so little had passed between them. He had imagined that Annabelle was glad he should feel this, and her sudden rebuff was like a blow. But her distress was so evident that he did not feel obliged to take her words literally. "I had no idea of following you," he answered. "I didn't even know you were here. But since I find you in such distress, how can I help asking if there's nothing I can do?" No, there's nothing," she cried, humiliated that this man of all others should surprise her in her childish wretchedness. "Well, yes, I am crying now. You can see I am, I suppose." She groped for the handkerchief. "But if anybody could do anything for me, do you suppose I'd be sitting here and just bearing it? It's because there's nothing anyone can do that I've come here to get away from people, to get away from everything. Can't you understand that?" she ended passionately. "I can understand your feeling so, yes. I've often thought you must." She gave him a startled look, and her face crimsoned. "But can't you see," he pursued, "that it's hard on a friend, a man who's ventured to think himself your friend, to be told, when he sees you in trouble, that he's not wanted, that he can be of no use, that even his sympathy's unwelcome?" Annabelle continued to look at him with resentful eyes, but already the mere sound of his voice was lessening the weight of her loneliness, and she answered more gently, "You're very kind." "Oh, kind," he echoed impatiently. "You've always been kind to me. I wish you hadn't been away for so long. I used to think that if only I could have asked you about things. But if you really thought that, why do you want to drive me away now that I am here?" He went up to her with outstretched hands, but she shook her head. "Because I'm not the Annabelle you used to know. I'm a strange woman, strange even to myself, who goes by my name. I suppose in time I'll get to know her and learn how to live with her." The angry child had been replaced by a sad but self-controlled woman, who appeared to Guy infinitely further away and more inaccessible than the other. He had wanted to take the child in his arms and comfort her with kisses, but this newcomer seemed to warn him to be circumspect, and after a pause he rejoined, with a smile, "And can't I be of any use, even to the strange woman?" Her voice softened. "Well, yes, you can. You are of use. Thinking of you as a friend does help me. It often has." She went up to him and put her hand in his. "Please believe that. But don't ask me anything more. Don't even say anything more now, if you really want to help me." He held her hand without attempting to disregard either her look or her words. Through the loud beat of his blood, a whisper warned him that the delicate balance of their friendship hung on his obedience. "I want it above all things, but I'll wait," he said, and lifted the hand to his lips. On the morning after his strange conversation with his wife, the Duke visited the Dowager in her new dwelling, the Dower House. The Dowager was always gratified by his visits, which were necessarily rare during the shooting parties, and led the way to the drawing-room. She seated herself near the hearth and took up her almshouse knitting. The Duke moved uneasily back and forth across the room, as his way was when his mind was troubled. "Won't you sit down, Ushant?" "Thanks, no." He returned to the hearth and took up a station before the chimney. "You're not joining the guns?" his mother asked. "No, Seaton will replace me. The fact is," the Duke continued in an embarrassed tone, "I wanted a few minutes of quiet talk with you." He paused again, and his mother sat silent, automatically counting her stitches, though her whole mind was centred on his words. She was sure some pressing difficulty had brought him to her, but she knew that any visible sign of curiosity, or even sympathy, might check his confidence. I have had a very, embarrassing experience with Annabelle," he began, and the Dowager lifted her head quickly, but without interrupting the movement of her needles. The Duke coughed and cleared his throat. A really incomprehensible experience." He threw himself into the chair opposite hers. "And completely unexpected. Yesterday morning, just as I was leaving the house, Annabelle asked me for a large sum of money, a very large sum. For £500. £500? The needles dropped from the Dowager's petrified fingers. She was thinking, that chit, I shouldn't have dared ask him for a quarter of that amount, much less his father. Aloud, she said, "But what does she want it for?" "Well, that's the point. She refuses to tell me." "Refuses?" the Dowager gasped. "Yes. First she hinted it was for her dressmaker, but on being pressed she owned it was not." "Ah, and then?" "Well, then I told her I'd pay the debt if she'd incurred it, but only if she would tell me to whom the money was owing. Of course, very proper. So I thought, but she said I'd no right to cross-examine her." "Oh, shan't. She called it that?" "Well, something of the sort. And as the guns were waiting, I said that was my final answer. And there the matter ended." "It could hardly have ended otherwise," the Dowager approved, thinking of the many occasions when a gift of £500 from the late Duke would have eased her daily load of maternal anxieties. Her son made no reply. "You certainly did right," she repeated. "Ah, there I'm not sure," the Duke muttered. "Not sure?" "Nothing's gained, I'm afraid, by taking that tone with Annabelle." He reddened uncomfortably and turned his head away from his mother's scrutiny. "At any rate, I thought it all over during the day. I thought of nothing else, in fact. And after she'd gone down to dinner yesterday evening, I slipped into her room and put an envelope with the money on her dressing-table." "Oh, shan't, how generous, how noble." The Duchess's hard little eyes filled with sudden tears at the thought of what such generosity on her own husband's part might have meant to her, with all those daughters to provide for. But Annabelle had no daughters, and no sons, and the Dowager's heart had hardened again before her eyes were dry. Would there be no limit to Ushant's weakness, she wondered? "Well, you're the best judge, of course, in any question between your wife and yourself, but I hope Annabelle will never forget what she owes you." The Duke gave a short laugh. "She's forgotten already." "Oh, shan't." He crimsoned unhappily, and again averted his face from his mother's eyes. "I'm sorry to bother you with these wretched details, but perhaps one woman can understand another where a man would fail." "Yes?" "Well, you see, Annabelle has been rather nervous and uncertain lately, and I've had to be patient. But I thought that when she found she'd gained her point about the money, she would wish to show her gratitude." "Naturally." "So, when the men left the smoking-room last night, I went up to her room. It was not particularly late, and she had not undressed. I went in, and she did thank me. Well, very prettily. But when I proposed to stay, she refused. Refused, absolutely." The Dowager's lips twitched. "Refused? On what ground?" "That she hadn't understood that I'd been driving a bargain with her. The scene was extremely painful," the Duke stammered. "Yes, I understand." The Dowager paused, and then added abruptly, "So she handed back the envelope?" Her son hung his head. "No, there was no question of that." "Ah, her pride didn't prevent her accepting the bribe, though she refused to stick to the bargain?" "I can't say there was an actual bargain, but..." Well, it was something like that. The Dowager sat silent, her needles motionless in her hands. This, she thought, was one of the strangest hours of her life, and not the least strange part of it was the light reflected back on her own past, and on the weary nights when she had not dared to lock her door. And then? Then, well, the end of it was that she said she wanted to go away. Go away? She wants to go off somewhere. She doesn't care where. Alone with her old governess. You know, the little Italian woman who's with Augusta Glenlow and came over the other night with the party from Champions. But how can I ask Augusta Glenlow to lend me her girl's governess to go, I don't know where, with my wife? Oh, it's out of the question, of course. Besides, the Duchess of Tintagel can hardly wander about the world in that way. But perhaps, if you're sure it's wise to yield to this fancy of Annabelle— Yes, I am, the Duke interrupted uncomfortably. Then why not ask Augusta Glenlow to invite her to Champions for a few weeks? I could easily explain, putting it on the ground of Annabelle's health. Augusta will be glad to do what she can. The Duke heaved a deep sigh, at once of depression and relief. It was clear that he wished to put an end to the talk and escape as quickly as possible from the questions in his mother's eyes. It might be a good idea. Very well. Shall I write? The Duke agreed that she might, but of course without giving the least hint. Oh, of course, naturally the Dowager understood that. Augusta would accept her explanation without seeing anything unusual in it. It wasn't easy to surprise Augusta. At Champions, the Glenlow place in Gloucestershire, a broad-faced, amiable brick house with regular windows and a pillared porch replaced the ancestral towers which had been destroyed by fire some 30 years earlier, and now, in ivy-draped ruin, invited the young and romantic to mourn with them by moonlight. Lady Glenlow herself had accomplished the unusual feat of having only 2 daughters and 4 sons. This, and the fact that Lord Glenlow had lived for many years on a ranch in Canada, and came to England but briefly and rarely, had obliged his wife to be a frequent traveller, going from the soldier sons in Canada and India to the gold miner in South Africa and the embassy attaché at St. Petersburg, and returning home via the northwest and the marital ranch. Such travels, infrequent in Lady Glenlow's day, had opened her eyes to matters undreamed of by most ladies of the aristocracy, and she had brought back from her wanderings a mind tanned and toughened like her complexion by the healthy hardships of the road. In this atmosphere, Miss Testvalley breathed more freely than in her other educational prisons, and when she appeared on the station platform to welcome Annabelle, the latter, though absorbed in her own troubles, instantly noticed the change in her governess. Annabelle had left Longlands with a heavy mind. She knew that the Duke, according to his rights, had behaved generously to her, and she would have liked to feel properly grateful, but she was conscious only of a bewildered resentment. She was sure she had done right in helping Conchita Marable, and she could not understand why an act of friendship should have to be expiated like a crime, and in a way so painful to her pride. She felt that she and her husband would never be able to reach an understanding, and this being so, it did not greatly matter which of the two was at fault. "I guess it was our parents, really, for making us so different," was her final summing up to Laura Testvalley in the course of that first unbosoming. Miss Testvalley remained silent for a long while after listening to her pupil's story, and when she spoke it was with a new softness. "My poor Nan, life makes ugly faces at us sometimes, I know." Annabelle threw herself on the brown cashmere bosom which had so often been her refuge. "Of course you know, you darling. I think there's nothing in the world you don't know." And her tears broke out in a releasing shower. Miss Testvalley let them flow, but when Nan had dried her eyes and tossed back her hair, the governess remarked quietly, "I'd like you to try a change of air first, then we'll talk this all over. There's a good deal of fresh air in this house, and I want you to ventilate your bewildered little head." Presently Lady Glenlow appeared, brisk and brown, in rough tweed and shabby furs. She was as insensible to heat and cold as she was to most of the finer shades of sensation, and her dress always conformed to the calendar, without taking account of such unimportant trifles as latitudes. "Ah, I'm glad you've got a good fire. They tell me it's very cold this evening. So delighted you've come, my dear. You must need a change and a rest after a series of those big Longland parties. By the way, dinner may be a trifle late. You won't mind? The fact is, Sir Helmsley Thwart sent a note this morning to ask if you might come and dine and bring his son, who's at honours, love. But now I'll leave you to rest, my dear, and don't make yourself too fine. We're used to pot luck at Champions." Annabelle, left alone, stood pondering before her glass. She was to see Guy Thwart that evening. It was her first escape from the long oppression of Tintagel and Longlands and the solemn London house, and freed from the restrictions they imposed, and under the same roof with the only two friends who truly understood her, she felt her spirits rising. "I know I'm always too glad or too sad, like that girl in the German play that Miss Testvalley read to me," she said to herself, and wondered whether Guy Thwart knew Clareshan's song, and would think her conceited if she told him she had always felt that a little bit of herself was Clareshan. "You spoke the other day about Clareshan's song. The evening my father and I drove over to dine at Champions," Guy Thwart said suddenly. He and Annabelle, at the day's end, had drifted out again to the wide terrace of Honourslove. They had visited the old house, room by room, lingering long over each picture, each piece of rare old furniture or tapestry, and already the winter afternoon was fading out in crimson distances, overhung by twilight. In the hall, Lady Glenlow had collected her party for departure. "Oh, Clareshan! Yes, when my spirits were always jumping up and down, Miss Testvalley used to call me Clareshan, just to tease me. And doesn't she any longer? I mean, don't your spirits jump up and down any more?" "Well, I'm afraid they do sometimes. Miss Testvalley says things are never as bad as I think or as good as I expect. But I'd rather have the bad hours than not believe in the good ones. Wouldn't you? What really frightens me is not caring for anything any more. Don't you think that's worse?" "That's the worst, certainly. But it's never going to happen to you, Duchess." Her face lit up. "Oh, do you think so? I'm not sure. Things seem to last so long, as if in the end they were bound to wear people out. Oh, look! The lights already, over there in the valley. This day's over, and suddenly you find you've missed your chance." No, for there'll be other days soon, and other chances. Goethe was a very young man when he wrote Clareshan's song. The next time I come to Champions, I'll bring Faust with me, and show you some of the things life taught him." "Oh, are you coming back to Champions?" "When? Before I leave?" she asked eagerly, and he answered, "I'll come whenever Lady Glenlow asks me." The drive back to Champions passed like a dream. To secure herself against disturbance, Nan had slipped her hand into Miss Testvalley's and let her head droop on the governess's shoulder. In her heart was a deep, delicious peace such as she had never known before. In this great lonely desert of life, stretching out before her, she had a friend who understood not only all she said, but everything she could not say. At the end of the long road on which the regular rap of the horses' feet was beating out the hours, she saw him standing, waiting for her, watching for her through the night. The Buccaneers was never finished. Before beginning work on the manuscript, Edith Wharton produced a synopsis outlining the entire plot of the novel, the planned ending of which was that Annabelle, Duchess of Tintagel, decides to leave her husband and run away with Guy Thwart. Laura Testvalley, moved by the youth and passion of the lovers, secretly lends a hand in the planning of the elopement, the scandal of which is to ring through England for years.